Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we are moving forward through the California Practitioner's Guide. Today, we will be focusing on all things Section 3. My name is Christina Zavala, and I am the Interim SELPA Director for Imperial County SELPA. Again, this project is brought to you in collaboration with Imperial County SELPA, the California Department of Education, and the CCEE, California Collaborative for Educational Excellence. Again, we are focusing on improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities, and I'd like to thank both our participants that are joining us in person, as well as our Zoom friends from across the state. Moving forward, so today's presentation is brought to you in a hybrid format. Again, we have participants both in person and on Zoom. This presentation will be brought to you in a webinar format, and we will be taking questions both in person as well as via Zoom. So we value your participation. In order to engage with us, you can utilize the chat box as well as the Q&A box, and we will be manning both the chat box and Q&A box as quickly as possible throughout this day. In order to access the resources for today's presentation, you can utilize the bit.ly link as well as scan the QR code, and you will find the slide deck and the Padlet with all of the resources for the day. Again, please feel free to utilize these resources, share them, make copies of them, and share them with your teams. They are here for your use to utilize in your districts. As we get started, please utilize the chat box to introduce yourself. We'd love to hear from our friends, those that are participating across the state, what district you're joining us from, your county office of education, your SELPA. Please share your position and your role. I'll give you a few seconds in order to get that going. And moving forward, I'd just like to introduce our small but mighty team again. I know this is our third time meeting together. There's been a few changes, but our former SELPA director, Dr. Deborah Montoya, is continuing supporting this project as now our lead consultant. And today, our presenters will be Lupita Olguin-Rubio. She is our SELPA coordinator, and she brings to us expertise in all things, in all areas of English language development. And Vanessa Lopez is our SELPA coordinator. She has 20 years of experience as a special education teacher and academic coach. She also focuses in the area of adaptive physical education and assistive technology. And myself, Christina Zavala, I'm current interim SELPA director. My background is in the area of school psychology, and also I've been serving as an administrator at the secondary level, SELPA coordinator for a brief period of time, and now current director, SELPA interim director. So now moving forward, I will pass it over to Vanessa Lopez as she'll get started as we dive into Section 3 of the Practitioner's Guide. Thank you.
You see me looking off to the side and then speaking directly to the camera, know that that's what we're doing. All right, okay, so good morning. As Christina mentioned, we are a small but mighty team. And before we move forward, I always like to share what it is that we individually bring to the table. Lupita later on, when she gets onto her own section of presenting the content for today, she'll let you know a little bit more about her background. So as Christina mentioned, my experience is largely in the field of special education. I taught special education K-6 in a K-6 setting for 18 years, RSP and SDC in one of our local districts. So you can say that English learners with disabilities was my bread and butter for those 18 years. Additionally, I was an instructional technology coach, an academic support teacher, a resource teacher, and an English language learner coach as well. Here at the SELPA, I support all things adapted physical education, assistive technology, and also this grant work. So as you well know, if you've joined us for our previous sessions, we are part of the One System of Support, the California One System of Support. If you want to know where we're located, if you're joining us via Zoom, We are right over here in this corner where Arizona, Mexico, and California meet. Right now we're enjoying fantastic weather, the summer not so much. We are part of the SELPA content lead team focusing on all things improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities, and we are proud to work within this one system of support of committed professionals that are out here to support you out in the field. So it's important for us to set the context of the why of our work. So those of us in special education, we are no strangers to these statistics. We know that roughly between 26% to 28% of the state's students with disabilities are English learners. So that is a very relevant piece of information because it should make us pause and ponder. What are some of the issues that might be contributing factors to this statistic? The California Practitioner's Guide was developed with this in mind. So we want to note that the guidance provided are a compilation of best practices in the exception of those statutes, regulations, and court decisions that are referenced within. So all of that to say that we're going to be diving into Section 3, specifically Chapter 5. As we've mentioned before in our sessions, the California Practitioner's Guide covers a variety of topics relevant to English learners with disabilities, the development of the IEP process for students who are dually identified, as well as considerations for proposing exit from special education services and reclassification. Today, we are focusing solely in Section 3. Section 3 is comprised of 3 chapters, and we're going to go through them in order. So I'm starting off with all things Chapter 5, developing the IEP for English learners. Again, specific considerations for students who have met eligibility criteria in one of the 13 distinct disability categories and who are also English learners. That is the focus for Chapter 5. Later on in the day, we're going to cover Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. But right now, we're roughly looking at the documents, the development of the individualized education program. So let's set that up with that in mind so that we can focus on the specifics of Chapter 5. Here we're looking at the legally required practices for making decisions for English learners. We also identify the steps for developing culturally and linguistically appropriate IEPs for English learners with disabilities. Additionally, we're going to identify who needs to be present at the table to have a fully informed IEP for students who have a disability and are English learners. Because we know that oftentimes the content that we share can be a bit overwhelming, and we also know that just IEPs alone, Chapter 5, the development of these documents can be a lot to take in. With that in mind, we are pairing our sharing of information today with our chapter-by-chapter infographics. So these one-pagers were developed to support your work, getting to know the content of Chapter 5. Here it looks pretty small, but once you click on the link and you pop it open, you can download it as a PDF or as a PNG. The PDF will give you access to links within the document, and you may access that for future support of the work. To set the context for what we're talking about when we're mentioning practitioners, the California Practitioner's Guide, roughly it's broken up into 2 groups, teachers and administrators. So every chapter addresses a particular set of questions from the scope of work that you might do. For teachers, what are the required components of the IEP for an English learner? How will progress on the IEP be monitored to the family and reported to the family? For administrators, what is required in that IEP? The role of families? How do we ensure that students continue to receive English learner services in addition to special education services? And also accessibility issues related to CASP and the LPAC. Very, very, very content heavy, so let's get started. California standards and resources are at the core of the work that we're going to be covering today. From the ELD standards to the content standards to the supporting principles of the English Learner Roadmap, and focusing specifically on the vision and mission. We know that there are 4 distinct principles in the English Learner Roadmap that inform the work that we do in ensuring that students are having access to quality education and practices for English learners. However, Principle 4 specifically talks about alignment and articulation across systems, and Lupita's going to focus in on that later on today when we're looking at the alignment and articulation within and across systems. But specifically, Principle 1 asks us to look at assets-oriented and needs-responsive schools. Within that scope of Principle 1, we are going to approach the topics covered in Chapter 5. We often make reference to the thread of educational benefit, right? Connecting the dots, if you will. To provide access and ed benefit, we ensure that we are making an offer for a free and appropriate public education, evaluation that is culturally and linguistically relevant, the IEP development process, ensuring parent and student participation, knowing that California is a consent state, so parents should be fully informed when they're making consent, and the least restrictive environment, right? A huge charge for us, not just statewide, but nationwide, and procedural safeguards. So in being able to articulate what goes into each of these steps specific to English learners with disabilities, which isn't much different, just some specific points that we're going to be highlighting today, really the end process and the end product is ensuring educational benefit. We often share data to ground our conversations just to give it a context and to, I don't want to say a sense of urgency, but yes, a sense of urgency. So when we look at CalPADS data from 2020, this is Fall 1 data. This is going to be no surprise to you, those of you that work with students who have met eligibility criteria for disability. We know that the top 3 are SLD, specific learning disability, speech and language impairment, and autism. So those are the top 3 oft-recurring disabilities in the state of California. 47.5% SLD. If you are not in the field of special education, this might seem shocking because there are 13 distinct disability categories. Those of us familiar with special education know that there are some low incidence disabilities, but specific learning disability is a troubling one because it is exactly there where some of the discussion that we've had in our previous sessions related to pre-referral interventions and pre-referral activities really come into place so that we can start teasing out whether it might be a language difference or a disability. Quick plug for our previous session, if you're interested in learning more about that, visit our website to access that recorded module. But going back to this image right here, the top 3, SLD, SLI, and autism. We love our acronyms in special education. What do you notice about those 3? When we think of a student who might meet eligibility criteria under one of these 3, what do we notice? There is a language underpinning. Language. So it's important for us to really understand when it might be a manifestation of the disability and when it might be related to issues of a second language acquisition. So critical for us to keep that in mind when we're looking at our students. I know it's difficult when we get caught up in the day-to-day of delivering instruction, developing IEPs, to really start discerning those little details, but it's important for us to consider that, especially because a lot of these manifestations of the disability might look different in reading than they do in listening, than they do in speaking, than they do in writing. So again, being very aware of these issues is going to be critical. So to narrow it down and not overwhelm us with a sense of dread of, oh my goodness, there's so much to do, we're going to focus on the 3 key decisions that are the jurisdiction of the IEP team for students who are dually identified. Number 1 is the language of instruction. Number 2, accessibility tools or use of an alternate assessment. And how and where will ELD designated instruction be provided? We always talk about comprehensive ELD, but today we're focusing on designated ELD instruction. Number one, if we go back to that image of the thread of educational benefit, one of those brief tenets that are outlined there is active and meaningful parent-guardian participation, critical to the multidisciplinary team. Very important for us to engage with caregivers, parents, guardians to be able to develop a more robust profile of our students, to be able to fully understand and make sense of additional information that might not be present or visible in our classrooms, that might in fact be impacting the learning, these invisible contributors to how it is that our students engage at our school sites. We also want to call out those tangibles, right? The procedural safeguards that we offer at every single meeting, and we want to document if the parents say, yes, I'll take it, no, I won't. Translated documents if requested, and the use of an interpreter if requested again. Knowing full and well that the use of an interpreter, parent request. If the parent is requesting an interpreter, all efforts should be made to provide an interpreter. If a parent requests translated documents, even if the meeting was held in English and whatever the parent's primary language was, if they make a request, the provision of those translated documents. Some of these requests, you might want to field those questions specific to your SPED directors as to timelines go, so that you might be fully informed. We always, always, always share information with you directly from the practitioner's guide and from our own experience, but we always invite you to check in with your site admin and your SPED directors for specifics in regards to procedures on how to ensure that these things are happening. Figure 5.1, Strategies to Support Active Parent Engagement, is a great resource that is found in the practitioner's guide. And then what this does is it gives you exactly what it says, some strategies to be able to engage with parents, to ensure active participation, meaningful participation, to fully inform the process. Sometimes it can be challenging to know exactly what to ask. So with that in mind, the practitioner's guide has included figure 5.2, which is Appendix 4.8 from Chapter 4. And this is a parent report for the IEP development. If you are looking for a way to mine information from a parent but don't know exactly where to start, this is a great form to do so. So whether you're engaging with a parent over the phone, via email, in person, Zoom, this is a great resource for you. If you have access to the form on your computer, know that these forms are downloadable and fillable. As you're speaking to parents, you can be taking notes directly into the document to collect and then include into your IEP documentation, transcribe, copy, paste. Again, resources that are supportive for your roles and responsibilities. After we've collected information from the parent, and remember that we talked about assessment data in our previous sessions, right? You've ensured that you've given assessment that is culturally and linguistically appropriate for students based on where they are, who they are. You have that data that is driving then the development of the IEP, but specifically our present levels. So when we are drafting the present levels of performance, here are a few reminders to support you in the development of these. Strengths, preferences, and are they clearly identified? Getting to know our students, right? That's going to give us buy-in when we consider what students are interested in. Once we know how they respond to certain things, it's going to help us develop some more connection with them. Concerns of the parent. Critical that we document concerns of the parent. And if those parent concerns are identified, how is it that we're planning to address them? More for the team to know, not necessarily to document. Annuals. What are we doing during annuals? Reviewing goals and objectives. When we're reviewing those goals and objectives, are they being met? Not? Are all sections of the present levels and functional performance addressed? Are the results that we are documenting the most recent for the student? Are we including hearing and vision screening for those, not initials and triennials, now they're plan reviews and eligibility reviews, right? and identifying all areas of need, specific goals necessary to address areas of need, and whether these clearly reflect the student's performance in the educational setting. Again, this checklist is here just as a reminder for when you're developing those present levels to ensure that these critical elements are being referenced. In the previous slide, we talked about the most recent assessment data. And we are talking specifically about English learners. So it is important for us to have an understanding as to what the English language proficiency assessment results are for students, whether they take the LPAC or the Alt-LPAC. We like to share this document with you because it gives you some very important information. So when we're drafting results when we're drafting the present levels for students, we want to look at the overall score because we document that on the present levels. But we want it to be more than a collection of numbers. What does this mean for instruction? What does this mean for the student? An overall score of 3 means what? Moderately developed. If you're looking for language to describe exactly where the student is in their English language development, the student score report will give you just that. You're also given a brief description as to what the LPAC is. The other thing that this form gives you is it gives you a level by level description. What can the student do at each level? This student at a level 3 was able to, can usually use English to learn new things in school. I'm simply reading what level 3 says. That information can be used to develop your present levels. When we look across to that second page now, we're able to see that it's been broken down further. So that overall score now gives you a breakdown by domain. Remember that slide with the disability categories? SLD, SLI, autism? How does the disability manifest? How does it impact the composites? When we're looking at oral language, we're looking at listening and speaking. This student is well developed for listening, somewhat moderately for speaking. That's giving me more insight now. And I'm thinking present levels, but I'm also thinking of areas of need to be addressed with goals and objectives. I'm also thinking of baselines, and I'm also thinking of linguistically appropriate goals and objectives. When I look at the written language composite, I'm looking at reading and I'm looking at writing. I'm thinking disability category. I'm thinking manifestation of the disability. I'm thinking linguistic supports. And I'm looking that for this student, the reading and writing skill is right about the same level. But it also begs additional questions. What does this mean in relation to task, in relation to purpose? What are they being asked to do with these language components? So again, a lot of information in just this student score report. We recognize that the LPAC and the Alt-LPAC is just one piece of information, but it's a critical piece of information. And it gives you a wealth of information for you to start developing your understanding of where the student is linguistically. However, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. We must also consider what does ELD instruction look like in relation to the scores that we were just looking at. I hit on this briefly, but we know that the LPAC addresses the 4 domains of language: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So we developed this image just to lay it out graphically, because sometimes we need that to really be able to see it. When we're looking at the overall score, we're talking about an overall score that considers all of the different domains. The LPAC specifically calls out the oral language composite, listening, speaking, and the written language composite, reading and writing. However, I also invite you to look at it vertically. When we look at it vertically, we have listening and reading on one side and speaking and writing on the second. Let's think back to the image with the disability categories, SLD, SLI, autism, manifestation of the disability, listening and reading. What type of language? Receptive. Speaking and writing. What type of language? Expressive. How does the disability manifest, and what supports might be necessary for the student in relation to receptive language and expressive language? Yes, we're talking about developing the present levels, but these questions should be present because the present levels drive what? The goal development. And then the goal development drives what? The services. So when we're looking at students who perhaps might be having some difficulties in oral language performance areas, listening or speaking, some of the considerations that we can start keeping in mind in relation, again, future development of that special factors page, what assistive technology might be necessary. When we're looking at written language performance areas, what reading and writing supports might be necessary. So again, we're still on the present levels. All of this information is present to support the development of an IEP that is appropriate for a multilingual learner who has a disability. So for those of us here, you can have a talk amongst the folks on your table. But for those of you joining us in Zoom, share in the chat the following. Here's the question. Must English language development goals be included in the IEP? Must ELD goals be included in the IEP? Remember, we are amongst friends. We don't judge. We learn. We learn together. And we learn when we share openly and freely. Must English language development goals be included in the IEP? Yes? No? I don't know. I don't know. And I will tell you, there is a lot of talk about this, but don't worry, I'll point you in the right direction. We're learning together. And I will give you citations too, as to who says so and where it says so. Must ELD goals be included in the IEP? Okay. And it might be a trick question. Information I could have given you beforehand, huh? All right, survey says no. IDEA requires that IEP goals be developed in the areas related to the student's disability. My favorite line is coming up next. Being an English learner is not a disability. Rather, state and federal requirements is to develop linguistically appropriate goals and objectives, LAGOs. Which means linguistically appropriate. Remember all the conversation we had based on that student score report? Means that the goals must be written at a level of linguistic ability of the student based on their current English language development. As evidenced by what? The LPAC or the Alt-LPAC. So no standalone ELD goals are necessary. There are 13 distinct disability categories one of which is not English learner. And at that bottom of that present levels page, what does it ask? What goals are going to be developed to address the needs that the disability is manifesting in the student, in the learning environment? So, not an ELD goal. Okay? Okay, Vanessa, great. But how do I do that? How do I develop a linguistically appropriate goal? I've been writing ELD goals, and it's okay if you have. I used to too. It's okay. Now we're going to write linguistically appropriate goals and objectives. I'm going to show you how to do it. So linguistically appropriate goals are not specific ELD goals, but rather goals that are aligned to the ELD standards. Say a student qualified for services under SLD, and we've developed goals in the area of reading comprehension. What I want to do now is go back to that ELD score report. I want to go back to my notes that I've been collecting when I go in and observe during ELD instruction, during my own time with the student, and thinking of what supports I've been providing for the student to access reading comprehension tasks. Chapter 5 on page 210 gives you additional information on how to do just that. However, because time is of the essence and because we have a lot to cover today, I want to point you to the 2 resources that you should go to, whether you work with students with mild to moderate disabilities, quote unquote, or students with more extensive support needs. If you have students that are taking the Alt-LPAC, you want to connect to the ELD standards via the, pardon the redundancy, the ELD connectors. The ELD connectors is a fantastic document that gives you access to the ELD standards as they are assessed with the alternate LPAC. Direct correlation to the ELD standards. Supportive tool in the development of linguistically appropriate goals. What do I mean by that? I know it's sort of small here and I'm gonna get a little close to read it. But the ELD standard part 1, section A, first standard is exchanging information and ideas with others through oral collaborative discussions on a range of social and academic topics. That's the actual ELD standard for kinder. The connector talks about exchanging information and ideas by participating in short conversations, responding to simple yes, no, who, what, when, where questions, using gestures or words, and by following some rules for discussions about familiar, social, and academic topics. If your student is taking the Alt-LPAC, your ELD instruction should be aligned to the ELD connectors. Okay? If you are working with students who are taking the regular LPAC with or without accommodations, their ELD instruction should be aligned to what? The grade level ELD standards. And remember, you're not writing a goal to directly support this standard, rather looking at the standard and what linguistics supports, you could pull to support your goal. As I mentioned, reading comprehension for a student who qualified under SLD, if we're looking at a way to really provide those linguistic supports for unfamiliar topics, it might be given a graphic organizer to support the student in collecting that information. And I can tell you with almost 100% certainty that all of you have been doing that already in your instruction.
we should check out how we're going to align standards with our students within their goals.
That was so brilliant, Lupe, that we're going to give you a microphone so you can say it. You don't need to turn around. You can just say it because we want our Zoom audience to hear you. You don't have to turn around. Just say what you said. It was brilliant. Just repeat it. Special factors, so important.
Okay, so special factors, wow. Okay, so I just think that it's really important because in the special factors, now that we have all those, what are they, like strategies, instructional strategies that would help us, that when we're developing those goals, it will help us align because you're telling, I'm gonna front load, I am going to translate. I don't know if everybody has had an opportunity to see all of those sections, but I think that those are very important because it will help us align linguistically those goals.
And that's a great point because, you know, we were talking about the present levels, but we also mentioned special factors. And this, depending on your IEP vendor, whether it be Cirrus, whether it be, we use SACE locally, I don't know what other ones might be out there, but you should all have those elements included within your IEP development vendor. So when you're thinking of your special factors, you have, you know, if the student is an English learner, what supports, right? What primary language supports. But then you also have the assistive technology section. And they should be complementary, not completely different. So again, when we're considering what the identified areas of need are and the goals that we're going to be developing, go back to the LPAC, go back to the LPAC, depending on which one it is that your students take, and what supports, linguistic supports, might be necessary to do so. That is what makes your goal linguistically appropriate. For a student who's a level 1, a goal that is not linguistically appropriate is having them write a 5-paragraph essay. That is not a linguistically appropriate goal. How would I make it linguistically appropriate? I would go to the ELD standards, look at a standard that's aligned with writing, and see what linguistic supports you might provide. Again, these are tools that will help you structure a linguistically appropriate goal. And we're actually working on a session that is specifically about writing linguistically appropriate goals, like a workshop where we get to sit down and write goals, coming soon. If you're still not clear as to what these might look like, we want to give you some examples. I learn a lot by looking at other people's work. And it sort of gives me some reassurance. When I see it, it's like, okay, I'm not too far off. So here are some examples: 3rd grade, 7th grade, and high school. You'll see that the standard is listed above: reading informational text for grade 3, standard 2. And the actual standard is identify the main idea of informational text. It gives you the key idea in detail, the ELD standard, and what the combination of both could look like as an IEP goal. These are in the actual practitioner's guide too. I know right now they're layered and you can't really see what's underneath, but if you've got the Padlet popped open, you can actually go into the document so you can see these. 7th grade example. Standard up at the top. Vocabulary acquisition and use, that's the area of focus. The ELD standard, and the combination of the two. Finally, for our high school example, I know we oftentimes neglect our high school friends. You have the standard up at the top, using transition words to justify claims, specific to text types and purpose. The ELD standard that supports this, and will give you ideas on linguistic supports and what the IEP goal might look like. Again, these are just examples. You might already be looking at this and thinking, no, I would have worded it different, and that's great. That is great, because that means that you're thinking about particular students that you work with, and you have a variety of ideas in your pedagogical repertoire to support students. Now, I know that sometimes it's hard, especially for our friends who are barely starting in this process of developing linguistically appropriate goals, considering special factors, considering assistive technology, accessibility resources. There's resources for that. We have the California Assessment Accessibility Resources Matrix that's going to definitely come back later on in the statewide assessments page. That gives you a smattering and then some of resources, UDAs, Universal Tools, Designated Supports, and Accommodations for the CASP and the LPAC. We have also linked our Padlet here, and this Padlet has all of the accessibility resources for both the CASP and the LPAC. These are updated, so you'll have the latest and greatest of these publications from CDE, CASP, and LPAC to help you take on this journey of looking at these accessibility resources as we are determining what's most appropriate for students. So let's not forget that we've talked about the LPAC, we've talked about present levels, and now we're going to look at what resources within our statewide assessment system might be accessible for our students and providing some linguistic supports. We know that universal tools and designated supports are available for all students. There is no need for an IEP or a 504 plan to access universal tools or designated supports. When you pop open that California Accessibility Resources Matrix, all of the U's, universal tools, all of the D's, designated supports, are available to all students. It's important for us to know this because for many years, we were a little wary of allowing students to access those designated supports. Or even in our classrooms, right? Like, oh no, like I don't want to allow that because then they're gonna become reliant on that and then on testing they won't be able to use it. No, designated supports can be used. So knowing what the accessibility resources offer per domain, we're thinking LPAC right now, is important because this is going to inform our selection of linguistically appropriate supports utilized to develop linguistically appropriate goals. And now to our friend accommodations. It gets a slide of its own because it's important. Accommodations do not reduce the learning or performance expectations. What do? They allow the student to complete an assignment or an assessment with a change in presentation, response, setting, timing, or scheduling, so that learners are provided equitable access during instruction and assessment. They do not reduce the learning performance or expectations. Speech to text. That's an accommodation. The standard is assessing, producing an essay on whatever topic, right? For a student that requires a change related to presentation, response, setting, timing, or scheduling is an accommodation. Response, speech to text. They are still able to access the standard and to engage with that assessment. Yes.
Okay, so I like the speech to text because now with the pandemic, our kids have gotten used to the Google documents and stuff like that, so they're able to dictate to the Google document. The problem is,
Sorry, we want
my
everybody
God.
to hear.
I know. Okay, so I like that, that you're able to implement the voice to text or the text speech to text using Google Documents. But when we're talking about the state test, there's only certain programs that are allowed, and a lot of those programs are not available for kids on a daily basis. So, for example, I tried it once with one of the programs that was allowed by the state during the testing, and it was not functional for the kid, for the student, because it was picking up even like the steps on like down the hallway, and it would translate into whatever the heck they wanted. And then the student was very frustrated because it was nowhere near what he had dictated to the computer. So my question to you guys, do you guys know a specific program that will be allowed through the testing portal that we can start implementing with our kids that need the speech to text?
So you bring up a lot of really important points. So no, it's good. It's good. Like I said, we're here to learn and we're here to ask questions, absolutely. So you mentioned something super important, and it's that it's not functional for the student, right? And I think that's the first step that we have to stop and consider, right? Not using the technology for the sake of the technology, but rather to serve the student. So I would wonder a couple of things. My first wondering would be, okay, did the student have like a headset with a mic so that it was only picking up what was there? And then my second question would be, what was the quality of that headset, right? And then my other question would be, if a lot of the other ones that are allowed aren't available, what can we do to make them available for students? So a lot of questions that are not necessarily related to like what your role in the classroom is, but again, that multidisciplinary team approach, right? Hey, assessment coordinator, this is what I noticed. What do we have available? Because oftentimes we're so disconnected from the people who make the decisions, who make the purchasing orders, who might train professionals on how to implement some of these, that we're put in a situation like that where you're trying to do what's best for the student to provide them this resource to support them, speech to text, but then it was just a source of frustration for him because it was collecting all of this information that it was not what he was saying, and for you because you're trying to help him and it's not working, right? So the number one thing would be, because these just got updated, I would need to go back in to see which programs are the ones that are allowed. And then maybe on that assessment Padlet that we put up there, maybe we could link some resources there so that you guys would have access to those. Because the other thing is also cost, right? Sometimes some of these resources have a price tag to them. So it would be a great idea. Again, we love learning from all of you and collecting something that's helpful for you. Maybe have a column for speech to text resources, right? And a quick, maybe like even a one-pager. Lupita, I'm giving myself homework. Like a quick one-pager that has maybe a couple of, like at a glance, these are some of the speech to text, these are some of the microphones, these are some of the headsets, right, that have been tested perhaps and that people have had good feedback on. So thank you for that. We'll look into that for you. Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So again, very critical points that include a bunch of other individuals that we typically don't include in the IEP process, right? When we're establishing what appropriate accommodations would be for statewide assessments, we would really want to check with our tech people at our site, right? If a student needs 2 devices, are we preparing with 2 devices? Do we have access to them? What does that process look like? Do I have a charging station? What headsets do I have? If that one breaks down, do I have another one ready? So again, super important to have as many people supporting you during this heavy, heavy lift. The accessibility resource graphics, they've changed. They look a little skinnier now. They're portrait now, not landscape. So we've linked those also here. These are the latest iterations of the accessibility resource graphics. You can also access them via the Padlet, but we wanted to let you know that there are resources out there to support you in this journey. So as you're looking at the IEP development, when we come to that statewide assessment determination, we know that some of our kiddos are going to require an alternate assessment. How do we make that determination? Well, first we start with accessibility. We want to ensure that we're providing them access to the LPAC first, with accommodations, without accommodations. However, we recognize that for some of our students, the LPAC with all of the accommodations is still not accessible. Well, the alternate assessment decision confirmation worksheet will help you work through that determination. We want to point out that the alternate LPAC is only for students who have the most significant cognitive disabilities. Most significant. Not students who qualified under SLD but haven't been able to, quote unquote, pass the LPAC. The alternate LPAC, like the regular LPAC, has task types. Debbie developed this infographic that lays out the 7 task types that are included in the alt LPAC. As you take a look at the task types, I invite you to start thinking about receptive language, expressive language, and because these are our students with more extensive support needs, what does their AAC look like? Are they having access to their AAC? Are we programming ahead of time? Are they at object permanence where they still need the actual object? The alt LPAC allows for that. Are we using PECs? How do these students that we are assessing with the alt LPAC communicate? That is very important. I really like to push back against the notion that students don't have language or don't communicate. We just haven't spent the time determining what their communication mode is. So again, very nuanced discussions. Ask your peers. Ask your speech and language pathologist friends who might have information on AAC devices. Talk to your speech and language friends also who might have ideas on how a student might engage. Talk to your peers who have extensive experience working with students with more significant needs and what some of their strategies, successful strategies have been. Just to give you a starting point. Again, if anything, we want to point out the importance of a multidisciplinary team and how our collective expertise is what's going to help our students move ahead. So we've been talking throughout about special factors. Assistive technology, we know it can be anything from no tech, low tech to high tech. Low incidence services for our students and any equipment that might be necessary. But specific to today for English learners, are ELs with disabilities provided with instructional systems and supports which meet their ELD needs and disability needs, and how and where is designated ELD provided? Looking first at assistive technology, again, no tech, low tech, high tech, and it could look in a variety of ways. It might address areas for reading, writing, time management, communication. We might be looking at built-in accessibility. It could look like software. It could look like an extension. It could look like an add-on. It could also be a highlighter. It could also be a graphic organizer. It could be a switch. It could be buttons. It could be anything. Anything is everything, and everything could be considered assistive technology as long as we are calling out that it is absolutely necessary for the student to have access to any piece of equipment, device that is able to allow them to close that gap of where they are and where we want them to be. As we mentioned, when looking at students with disabilities who multilingual learners, who are English learners, comprehensive ELD is at the crux of it all. When we talk about comprehensive ELD, we're talking about both integrated and designated. Integrated ELD is regular class time throughout the day, where the ELD standards are utilized in tandem with the focal standards, the California content standards. Designated ELD, though, is that separate time, protected time, where the ELD standards are the focal standards. So this is what the traditional, I guess, ELD would be, right? That set aside time of day where the ELD standards are the focus. And again, the ELD standards or the ELD connectors if your students are taking the Alta LPAC. In all of this, of course, we want to call out the importance of considering the individual. When we're looking at the continuum of supports and services, specifically related to the free and appropriate public education and the least restrictive environment, we really want to look at providing access first to the least restrictive environment, which we know is the general education classroom. And I invite you also to think about the fact that all of our students are Gen Ed students first. This is where we start, okay? We don't start at the bottom and have them graduate up. That's not what we do. We start at the least restrictive environment, and then we start layering supports, not assigning locations. Special education is a service, not a place. And as it relates specifically to our English learners, first of all, we all know that no group is monolithic. English learners are not monolithic. English learners are a diverse group. They're newly arrived with adequate schooling, newly arrived with limited formal schooling. They are English learners who are developing normally. What does that mean? Long-term English learner, or at risk of becoming a long-term English learner. Not monolithic. Many typologies. These noted on the slide and everything in between. Just like every individual is a collection of dimensions of identity. Typically, we talk about autism as a spectrum. I believe every disability has a spectrum. Every English learner has a spectrum. We all as individuals are on a spectrum. We are a compilation, if you will, of strengths and weaknesses. Jagged learner profiles. In comprehensive ELD, we also have considerations for the least restrictive environment and selecting interventions in line with the individual needs of the student. From primary language proficiency, second language proficiency across domains, the linguistic demands of the literacy intervention that we're providing for students, the availability of native language supports. For designated ELD, are they being grouped with students with similar proficiency levels? Except we know that students don't come in perfect groups of 20 or 30, so you might not have the perfect breakdown. But as long as the aim is there, that's what we're interested in. And for targeted interventions, we know that English learners may benefit from being grouped with peers with similar learning needs. Again, a lot of these bits of information aren't necessarily new to all of us, but it's sort of reassuring to see like, okay, yes, this is exactly what the goal is, and it is exactly the goal that we've been working towards. So let's put it all together. Let's make some connections with a lot of our school-based initiatives. LCAP, roadmap, it all really does come together. Provision of basic services, implementation of state standards, and course access, all of that is called out specifically in the practitioner's guide and the English learner roadmap, specifically through principles 1, 2, and 4. When we talked about being assets oriented and needs responsive, we're addressing school climate, campuses that are affirming and inclusive and safe. And specifically called out is element 1E, where schools and districts develop a collaborative framework for identifying dually identified students, English learners with disabilities, and use valid assessment practices, as well as the intellectual quality of instruction and meaningful access. Instruction and meaningful access. What's going to guide the instruction for those of us that are developing those goals and objectives? Those linguistically appropriate goals and objectives. How are we providing meaningful access? Through linguistic supports that make the content meaningful and accessible. So now, I shared a lot, and I want to give you a break. Our goal is to give you a break every hour on the hour. We started at 8:30, it is now 9:34. But before I release you on a 10-minute break, much needed 10-minute break, I want to pose the following question. How does your multidisciplinary team address the needs of dually identified students in the IEP process? More of a reflective question, but I want you to ponder that because I want to spend about a minute or two when we return from the break to talk about this. So keep it in mind, 9:34, see you back at 9:45. I'll give you an extra minute. See you at 9:45. All right, everybody, welcome, welcome, welcome back. So hopefully you used these 10 minutes to walk away from your screen if you're joining us on Zoom, and to get a drink, relax, stretch, and maybe consider our question. So our question is, how does your multidisciplinary team address the needs of dually identified students in the IEP process? If you're joining us on Zoom, feel free to drop it in the chat. If you are joining us here live, feel free to share with us. You don't have to. As I said, this is more of a reflective question. And what I do want to do is I want to go back to one of the questions that was asked by our live participants, which was about speech to text. And I did some research and I found that, you're going to like this, that speech to text is now included as an embedded within the test. So I linked it to the Padlet. So if you go back to the Padlet, you scroll down on the column for chapter 5. I added a coffee session, I think it's called, and it gives some updates on TOMS, but there is a section specific to speech to text, and it talks about how now it's included. So it's part of, it's an embedded tool.
But I think it's only available for certain sections.
Yes, yes. And another thing also that we want to remind you is that there is unlisted resources. So if there is an accessibility resource that you utilize for daily instruction that the student is used to, you can always write to request use of an unlisted resource. If you look at the California Accessibility Resources Matrix, there's a section that details that process specifically. Please do that. CDE has often encouraged us to utilize that. It's there for a reason. We can request access. So hopefully that document will help. And if you look at the California Accessibility Resources Matrix and the Accessibility Resource Graphics, you'll see also what's an embedded support and which ones are non-embedded. All right. So because we are covering 3 chapters in one day, we want to provide you with the same questions that we would typically utilize with groups where we're doing a breakout session. However, these are important questions for you to consider to take back to your teams. If you're joining as a team, fantastic. You've already started the most important work. If you are participating as an individual, now you have some tools, resources, and supports to take back to your teams. But these are some of the questions that we want you to consider. Where are the references to the IEP regarding how and where comprehensive ELD is provided? What primary language supports and resources are being provided to the student? What accessibility tools, designated, embedded, and non-embedded, and accommodations are being provided to the students to meet his or her needs as they relate to students who are dually identified? Again, the 3 key decisions that are the jurisdiction of the IEP team in relation to dually identified students. Now, it's always nice to see what it could look like. And to do that, the California Practitioner's Guide includes a student scenario. This is our lovely Cruz. We met Cruz when she was a kindergartner. We saw her progress through the years, had some difficulty learning, had some pre-referral interventions. There was a pre-referral process. She was recommended as being eligible for assessment to determine whether she's eligible for special education services, and she was, and now we're developing the IEP. We're putting all the pieces together. So through Cruz, we're going to learn about the IEP process as specified in Chapter 5. This student scenario really lays it out as an exemplar of what the process could look like. And it's always useful for us as practitioners to take a look at what it might look like, because again, some of it can be incredibly affirming, while some of it might reel us back and make us reflect as to what could change. And more than anything, provide us with some actionable next steps. On your own, you can read the scenario, you can share out your key findings in the chat box, or feel free to add any questions and wonderings in the Q&A. Again, because of time, we won't be able to do much of this, but we do want to provide you this resource and have it at your fingertips to engage with your teams in this valuable discussion. To tie it all together, we also want to provide you with another tool. We talked about 3 key decisions that are the jurisdiction of the IEP team. However, we know that there are other components included within the IEP that are not necessarily specific, but are critical to really spend time thinking about in relation to the development of the IEP. Appendix 5.1 is a checklist for English learners. As a recommended activity as a team, we would invite you to take a random sample of an IEP, review each item of the checklist. Again, black out any names, any identifiable data, and just look at the content. If your team is at this point of the journey where you're ready to start taking a critical look at the processes, this is a great tool to do that. If you're not there, that's okay. This is a resource for you then, as you are developing your own IEP and ensuring that all of these different areas are addressed. Is there data indicating that the student is an English learner? Does the IEP include current level of English language proficiency? Not CELT, because I've heard that, oh yeah, we use CELT. No, CELT was some years back. We're now using the LPAC. If the student is a 5th grader, making sure that we're including data from 5th grade, not 1st grade. I know that with the past 3 years that shall remain nameless, it was hard to have accurate data. But from this point forward, start looking at additional information that might help us generate a more robust learner profile. Because really what we want to focus on are linguistically appropriate goals. Were all those specific items on the checklist met? Special factors page, primary language supports, where is comprehensive ELD taking place? Specifically designated. And what next steps could the team take to ensure that every IEP of English learners with disabilities is written to meet their individual cultural and linguistic needs? It's a tall order, I know, but necessary. As we get ready to transition into chapter 6, I want to give you a couple of minutes for you to pause and ponder. Think of new learnings or continual wonderings, and wonderings are fine. New learnings are great. It's very validating for us, but if you still have wonderings, let us know. Let us know. We really appreciate being thought partners and supportive to your efforts in helping improve outcomes for English learners with disabilities. That being said, I'm going to pass over the baton to my friend Lupita, who's going to take us through chapter 6 of the California Practitioner's Guide. Lupita?
Thanks, Vanessa. Oops. Okay, folks. So chapter 5 was all about considerations in the development of the IEP itself and highlighting some of the resources that can be found in the California Practitioner's Guide to help us really reflect on our current practices. How might we improve our current practices and impact perhaps policies, written or unwritten, that evidently will set a trajectory for English learners with disabilities. So if we're sitting here, whether you're here in person or in Zoom land, and thinking about your current practices, then we're on the right track. The resources that we provide to you, although are not required, some of them are, but many of them are not, the ones that live in the Practitioner's Guide. They really present an opportunity for us to reflect and think about where might we need to address and adjust our practices. What are some considerations that we haven't thought about before when talking about our English learners with disabilities? Who might we need to lean on or extend a handout to, either to support or to connect? Again, working together, working smarter, working more efficiently in support of our students, our English learners with disabilities. This next leg of our day today is going to focus on chapter 6. Chapter 6 is the second chapter in section 3, Educational Programs and Instructional Strategies. Chapter 6 focuses primarily on access and equity for English learners with disabilities. As indicated before, each chapter is organized with some key or guiding questions, either for practitioners or administrators or both, as well as an accompanying graphic organizer, or rather infographic, that Vanessa has created to accompany the chapter. Again, if you access the infographic and you hover over the different elements of the infographic, it'll take you directly to the page in the Practitioner's Guide where you'll be able to find more language, more information around those images or titles or topics. So I invite you to take a look at all of our infographics. If you're accessing this resource through our website, you'll be able to download it in different sections, and as well as in such a way that you're able to create a slide deck to provide support to your staff, or just an opportunity for you to better integrate the information. Again, we take pride in that we try very hard, very diligently to practice what we preach and provide resources and different modes to be able to access this wonderful, very rich, very dense, very lengthy document, which is the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. I do want to share just a little bit about myself for those of you who don't know me. So my contribution to this team, to this wonderful team, is that of a general education practitioner. By training, I'm a general education teacher, and I've worked here at Imperial County Office of Education for 20 years in the curriculum department, where my projects and scope of work has been primarily in support of teachers and leaders at the state, regional, and local level addressing needs of English learners. Training on the ELD standards, training on different curricula and instructional programs designed for English learners, providing technical assistance and support to teams. So that basically is my lens. And I'm very proud of the fact that I'm able to connect with my special education colleagues in this team and statewide as we work together and strive to have a better impact on the support and services of our English learners and English learners with disabilities. So it's important for you to understand the dynamic of our team and how deliberate it was in coming together, because we do, by modeling this, we do send the message that it's absolutely critical for us to connect with each other, general education, special education, administrators, practitioners, support providers. We want to be able to connect and bring our respective lenses to this work in refining and improving our practices and procedures to support English learners and English learners with disabilities. So our focus for Chapter 6, as you can see here, this is the summary, is again for us to be able to ensure that we're using all of the resources afforded to us, those required and those recommended, in support of our English learners with disabilities, to ensure that we're providing full access to comprehensive ELD, to an academic curriculum that is rich and standards-based, that the EL services that are required, as well as the disability-related services that are required, are being implemented and progress monitored, again, to ensure that students are making the appropriate progress with the appropriate supports. And so that is our focus for Chapter 6. So as we navigate through Chapter 6, we're going to be talking about what that might look like, what are some considerations, and what are some resources that can be found in the California Practitioner's Guide to help us implement a smoother implementation of standards-based curricula, EL services, and disability-related services. So again, all students are entitled to a free and appropriate education, quality appropriate education. And it's important for us to recognize as practitioners and leaders that there are federal and state laws that we must implement, that we must be familiar with in order to be able to do this, in order to be able to provide the highest quality education, the appropriate supports, and the required services for our English learners and our English learners with disabilities. So again, Title III is one of those. Title III is a federal entitlement, supplemental services for all English learners. It's not a nice thing to do, it's a must do. All of our English learners, including our English learners with disabilities, must receive Title III services in the state of California that is in the form of comprehensive ELD, both designated and integrated. Another resource out of the state of California is the California English Learner Roadmap. The California English Learner Roadmap is California's policy for implementing effective practices, systems, supports, and collaboration among different districts and organizations, all in support of our multilingual learners here in the state of California. The English Learner Roadmap was approved by the State Board of Education, was unanimously approved by the State Board of Education in 2017. You can find the different elements of the California English Roadmap by accessing this resource within the Padlet. But the California Practitioner's Guide also has related resources that can be found in the roadmap itself. So it's important for us to recognize that such a document as the English Learner Roadmap, how its resources exist in the California Practitioner's Guide, sends that message that's imperative that we connect and reach out to our respective colleagues, general education, special education, as we are moving forward in addressing the needs of our English learners with disabilities. It's imperative that we all fully understand the federal and state requirements that afford these very specific and necessary services for our students. It's not either or. If an English learner doesn't receive the required services, how can we justify reclassification? How can we justify they're not making adequate progress if we are not implementing comprehensive ELD the way that it's designed, if we're not becoming familiar with the ELD standards? Same with an English learner with a disability. Once the student is identified as needing appropriate special education services, the EL services must remain. It's not either or. Why? Because Title III is a requirement, right? Students must receive and continue to receive these services until we, the educational agencies, the practitioners, the leaders, those of us who make decisions about what is best for our students, are fully identified that the student no longer needs these services through evidence of being able to have mastered the English language comparable to his or her English-only speaking peers. We must be sure of that, because once we remove those services or keep from providing those services, we are unjustly serving our students. It is a disservice. So again, folks, it's imperative that we become familiar with all of these federal and state laws and the accompanying resources that are designed to help us, regardless of your position, regardless of your scope of work, that are designed to help us to have a better approach in addressing the needs of our students, all of our students. So I talked a little bit about what the California English Learner Roadmap is, but I'm going to hand it over to the expert, a champion of English learners, a key contributor and author of the California English Learner Roadmap, Dr. Lori Olson, to give us an overview of this wonderful resource.
It's a new day for English learners in California. In July of 2017, the State Board of Ed unanimously passed a new policy called the English Learner Roadmap, which supersedes the old Proposition 227 English Learner Policy. The English Learner Roadmap is a clear turn away from the days of deficiency-oriented views of English learners. It's a turn away from the old English-only world and sentiment, and it's really embracing a future for California that's about preparing our kids, not just for career and college readiness, of course, but also for leading and thriving in a global, multilingual 21st century world. In November 2016, the voters of the state passed Proposition 58, the EDGE initiative, which basically said we want our children to have more opportunities to become proficient in multiple languages. It was followed shortly after by the development of this new English Learner Roadmap, which says for our English learners, we want an education that'll best prepare them for the 21st century, and that includes high-level intellectual work with all of the supports they need to engage in that kind of work, and with an education that gives them the opportunities to develop skills in multiple languages. The English Learner Roadmap provides our districts and our schools with a clear, comprehensive statement of what needs to be put in place for our English learners if we're going to get them to the education that we know that they need. It covers everything from professional development, leadership development, assessment, alignment, preschool through high school, the quality of instruction, the access to the courses students need to be college ready by the time they graduate. It covers the climate and the attitudes in our schools and the need to create safe, affirming, inclusive environments for our children that embrace the languages and cultures they bring. The English Learner Roadmap will mean for our English learners an education of a breadth and a depth that has not been available to them thus far. The English Learner Roadmap, to the extent that it's really fully implemented, will mean for students that they really do have preparation for college, that they really will have the facility in multiple languages, which will give them connections both to family and heritage and to other cultures and communities and to jobs all over the world. The English Learner Roadmap will mean that our students get science and social studies and the arts and are able to be full participants in the academic setting and full participants in their world and is able to get them to their goals.
Academic discussions, participation.
1, 2, 3.
Yes!
It's a
right? It's the California English Learner Roadmap by design is going to, when used and when implemented, is going to be able to provide resources and tools and opportunities for district and site leadership and practitioners to come together to talk about how to best to address, how best to support, better understand the resources that are designed to help us help our students. Again, it's a way to articulate between systems and design a seamless approach in addressing the needs of all of our kiddos, particularly our English learners and English learners with disabilities. Principle 1 of the English Learner Roadmap indicates an assets-based approach to our systems, to instruction, to our processes. The English Learner Roadmap has identified this organization, the Center for Culturally Responsive Teaching and Learning, as an exemplar organization in addressing Principle 1. You can access more information on this center by clicking on the images, the little metal icon on the left side of the slide, to find more information about what a full implementation of Principle 1 of the roadmap may look like. But ultimately, what we want to share with you today is in order to provide equitable access for our English learners and English learners with disability, we must take into consideration cultural and linguistic factors that impact their learning. Because as we are progressing through, as students are progressing through their academic grades, and they are not being provided access by the lack of linguistic support, let's just start there, then that is going to impact not only their progress, but their deep learning of the content and understanding of how to use the English language in accessing and engaging in content. So again, we have to take this element into consideration. And more importantly, we need to fully understand the resources that are afforded to us to be able to do this. And what does that look like? What does culturally and linguistically responsive teaching and learning look like? And again, that's why we share this resource. The roadmap has identified an organization that we can tap into and look for as examples for how to implement culturally and linguistically responsive elements in education. Another resource that we share with you, and I'm going to give you some time to explore Figure 6.1. This resource can be found in the Practitioner's Guide, and it contains different elements that research has indicated are going to support educational learning for English learners with disabilities. So I'm going to give you some time and I ask Vanessa to drop the link into the chat. You can also access it directly from the slide deck or the Padlet. So I'm going to give you just a few minutes to review the elements in this resource, the California Values for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. As you are exploring this resource, I want you to think about your site, your classroom, your district, and think about where might have you seen evidence for any one of these values. Think about examples or evidence of those values being implemented daily, consistently, once in a while. So I'll give you about 5 to 7 minutes to do that. Let's do 5 minutes, Vanessa, on the clock. So as you are reading, take note of some language, some words, some phrases in each one of these values, and be prepared to share out what resonates with you and where might you have seen evidence of any, some, or one of these values at your respective sites and districts. We'll do 5 minutes on the clock. As you're gathering your thoughts about what you might want to share out either in the chat or here in person with us, I want us to focus on that word value or values. So when I think about things that I value, usually there is evidence for that in my life, right? Whether it's at work or at home. For example, if I say that I value a healthy lifestyle, it's very likely that you might be seeing me, taking a nightly walk. Or you might not find potato chips or soda in my fridge and cabinet. So again, values, something that I value, something that we value as an organization or personal, there's going to be evidence of it and consistent evidence of it. Because if I fall off my health wagon, right, you're going to see evidence of potato chips and soda. All right. So again, values, there should be evidence of what we value and what we appreciate. And so again, just to set the context for what this document, this research-based document, because these elements are research-based, I also want to highlight by beginning to share out with you that by design, our team, our Improving Outcomes for English Learners with Disabilities team, by design, we are implementing and valuing that final value in this document, sharing the responsibility in that we together, general education, special education, EL specialists, are coming together to address the needs of English learners with disabilities statewide by providing resources and support through this document. So there is evidence of that, and it's mostly on our website and here today. So again, I just want to ask you to think about that. And it's more about being reflective than about what you're not doing or perhaps what you're not sure about. So I invite you to think about any one or some of the values identified in figure 6.1 and drop in the chat some insights as to where might you have seen evidence of this, and then reflect, what haven't I seen? What am I not familiar with? And what is my role in beginning to implement some of these very important values? And I invite our participants in person to reflect and share out with us as well. Okay, folks. So again, at any given point, if there's something that you want to share out, either in person or in the chat, please feel free to do so. I encourage you to take this document and study it, and maybe use it as a gauge to see what you're looking for, what's not visible, at least to depending on your scope of work and what you're able to see. But again, a very important resource to help us start reshaping, refining our current educational landscape for English learners with disabilities. So we'd like to share this resource, also found in the Practitioner's Guide, but it was originally designed for the ELA-ELD framework. So this resource encompasses, and is actually titled The Circles of Implementation. The Circles of Implementation, a high quality curricula for all of our students. And if you take some time to kind of read the different titles and the organization of it, I want you to take note of the white band and those key topics. We want to make sure that in order to provide an access and an equitable curriculum for all of our students, we want our curriculum to be integrated. We want it to be the environment to be motivating and engaging, respectful, and intellectually challenging, meaning standards-based for all of our students. Vanessa might have introduced you, or maybe you were already familiar with, the ELD connectors. So when we talk about intellectually challenging, those connectors are standards-based because they're directly related to the ELD standards that have been modified and adjusted to address the needs of our students with the most significant needs. So again, we can absolutely provide access for all of our students, as diverse needs as they may be. Number one, we are required to. Number two, there are plenty of resources that are specifically designed to do just that. And more importantly, we want to recognize that language is at the core of all curriculum. It is how we engage in learning. It's how we respond to learning, right? So listening, speaking, reading, and writing require language use. Receptive language, what I am listening to or reading, right? What's happening in my brain? How am I processing it? What types of supports might I need as an English learner and an English learner with disability to help me process that receptive language that I'm listening to or that I'm being asked to read? Those are the considerations, right? Now, what about expressive language? How might I be able to best show what I know? What types of supports can be afforded to me as an English learner with a disability to be able to write more clearly and explicitly what I have been taught? Because I understand it, I just don't have the full capacity of the English language to be able to write it out in a coherent way. But there's some tools there that can be afforded to me for me to be able to not only be able to do that more effectively, but to learn how English works and be able to use those scaffolds that were provided to me and implement them in my daily response to language. So again, intellectually challenging, there are tools and resources that we absolutely can use to address the very unique needs of the population of students that we're referring to. So again, language is at the core of all curriculum. For this population of students, our English learners, the California ELD standards play a critical role. Not a nice thing to do, it's a must do, right? Title III requires us to provide comprehensive ELD. In the state of California, comprehensive ELD, designated and integrated, is designed around the ELD standards. If we are implementing ELD without the ELD standards, we're missing the mark, folks. And more importantly, our students are missing the mark. So when we're having conversations about progress or lack thereof, whether it's IEP goals or linguistic goals, it's a result of a lack or a gap in quality English language instruction. And we say, well, you know, they go to ELD, but are the ELD standards being implemented? That would be my next question. Yeah, there's a part of the day that the student may be receiving English language instruction or English language support. What is the role of the ELD standards in that instruction or support? Very important question to ask. So on that note, we're gonna pause and take a quick, I don't think we're gonna do a poll, but I think we'll just do a response in the chat and live here. Can a special education teacher provide integrated and designated ELD to English learners as part of their special education services? Yes, no, I'm not sure. And if you're here with us, you can do a thumbs up, thumbs down. Not sure. What say you? We're getting some ups, some downs, some más o menos. So can the special education teacher provide comprehensive ELD as part of the student's special education services? The answer is yes, absolutely. Again, Title III requires supplemental EL services for all English learners, including English learners with disabilities. They don't stop being an English learner because now they're required to receive special education services. They are still in need of that linguistic support. So yes, certificated special education teachers who have their EL authorization absolutely are able to provide the support. But I'm going to go back to, we're going to talk about co-teaching in a little bit as well, but I'm going to go back to the ELD standards. The answer is yes. It's not maybe, it's not if. The answer is yes, right? So if the answer is yes, and I am working with English learners, I ask you to think about this. How familiar am I with the ELD standards, and how am I using them to design and deliver the supports that the students need? Because that's the critical question. English language support without the ELD standards, we're missing the mark, folks. Because remember, students are going to be assessed on the LPAC to gauge progress. And the LPAC is designed to assess the ELD standards. So we need to really take into consideration what we're doing and what we're not doing, again, to work smarter, to be able to provide the appropriate supports and the required services of our students. So again, if language is at the core, and we all agree that that is to be true, and that for our English learners in the state of California, comprehensive ELD is a requirement, and the ELD standards are how we design and deliver comprehensive ELD as assessed by the LPAC, we need to connect the dots, right? We need to kind of align our dots in many cases. So again, seek out that information, seek out that support, seek out that training if it is something that we need to refine in our current practices. So let's talk about comprehensive ELD. Comprehensive ELD are two types of ELD instruction, not either or, two types. So all English learners must receive comprehensive ELD, and in the state of California, it's comprised of integrated ELD and designated ELD. So let's talk a little bit about what integrated ELD is. So by design, integrated ELD is designed to provide access to content, to math, to science, to social studies, to language arts, to PE, right? So integrated ELD by design is we use the ELD standards to support or to supplement the content standards so that English learners are able to access math, science, and social studies, both receptively, what they hear and what they see, and expressively, how they respond to that instruction. So without providing the appropriate access via the ELD standards, English learners across the content area are not going to have full access to the curricula, will not be able to respond to what they may or may not be picking up as a result of not having the appropriate supports. So integrated ELD happens throughout the instructional day. It's designed to provide access, and in the process, developing listening, speaking, reading, and writing skills within the content area. This is how we support and develop academic English for our English learners, right? The language of the text is academic, therefore the scaffolds will provide academic English support. So now let's shift our attention to designated ELD. Designated ELD, on the other hand, is a protected time. It's its own block of time, like math is its own block of time. Science, it's its own block of time. We devote some time to this particular content. So designated ELD, we provide this time to the content of understanding how English works and providing instruction on how to develop language skills based on the student's language proficiency. That means that this protected block of time is comprised of students who are at the same language proficiency level. A class for your emerging students, a class for your expanding students, a class for your bridging students. So we are organizing our schedules with our English learners' required needs In this case, we're talking specifically about designated ELD, and organizing our schedules to provide designated ELD for groups of English learners by language proficiency level. The purpose of designated ELD is to provide ongoing instruction of ELD using the ELD standards. So your ELD standards are your core standards, not your math standards, not your reading language arts standards, but your ELD standards. And you're only focusing on the standards designed for that particular proficiency level that you're working on. The goal is to provide opportunities for students to gain and acquire English language skills so that they eventually become fluent English proficient and qualify for reclassification, right? Okay, so again, in a nutshell, comprehensive ELD is comprised of two types of instruction. One happens throughout the day, where the ELD standards are designed to support and give access to the content across the instructional day. And the other one, designated ELD, the ELD standards are your focus standards, where this is a protected time every day throughout the week, every day of the school year, where students are given instruction of English language through the ELD standards. So again, access and language development. That's our focus for the respective ELD instruction through comprehensive ELD. So let's explore together what comprehensive ELD is. We have this resource that we use, that we borrowed and kind of recreated through the belief modules, and we like to share it with you when we talk about this topic of comprehensive ELD, because it could be a little tricky, especially if you are new to ELD instruction. So we want to give you some time to work either in teams if you're here in person, maybe a buddy up with somebody, or if you're joining us via Zoom with a team or with a partner, feel free to work together. So I'm going to ask Vanessa to drop the bit.ly for this resource in the chat so that you have access to it more readily. And what you're going to do is, once you click on the bit.ly, you're going to see several tiles with some topics written on them. You'll be able to manipulate those tiles. So the objective of this engagement activity is for us to establish some common understanding of the differences and similarities between integrated and designated ELD. So I think we're gonna put about 8 minutes on the clock to let you engage in this Venn diagram activity. And when we reconvene, we'll debrief and we'll clarify any questions that you may have and talk about where the tiles landed and how they relate to each other, what's similar and what's different. So Vanessa, can we please put 8 minutes on the clock? I hope we were able to give you sufficient time to not only engage in this activity, but in the process allow you some time to either think to yourself, reflect, or engage in a dialogue with somebody that you might have been doing this engagement strategy with. So let's debrief. So let's focus on the tiles that land on integrated ELD. So take a moment to kind of read through them, think about where you place them. Let us know if you have any questions, but I'm going to walk you through them very quickly. So again, as stated earlier, integrated ELD happens throughout the instructional day, all day long, and it is above and beyond separate in addition to designated ELD. The focus of integrated ELD, because by design it's designed to provide access, the focus is on content and language objectives. We want to be able to identify what our content objectives are in math, science, social studies, and then consider what types of language supports, linguistic supports, are going to be necessary for the English learners in the class. Because it happens throughout the instructional day across content area, all our students are going to benefit for the supports that you've identified or implementing for your English learners. For example, if you know that your English learners in your class during math are going to benefit from some language frames when it comes to word problems, and you make those accessible to all of your students, but are encouraging or requiring your English learners to use them, all students might be able to benefit from those language frames. Or tools like graphic organizers, which are a research-proven strategy to support content knowledge for English learners. All students can benefit from these resources. So again, although integrated ELD is a required service for English learners, because it happens throughout the instructional day across the curricula, the resources, the language resources that you provide, both for receptive understanding and expressive knowledge, all students in your class are going to benefit from them. So for integrated ELD, the ELD standards are used as a scaffold. Think of them as a scaffold for your content, right? You're thinking about what supports your English learners may need in listening, speaking, reading, and writing as it pertains to your content objectives, and you use the ELD standards with the students' English proficiency in mind to be able to craft those scaffolds for your content. And then the lesson is driven by the content demand because we're teaching math, and we're thinking about what do I need to do to scaffold the content, the mathematical content, so that the English learner is able to understand, so that they're receptive understanding, so that I'm aligning the tools to build receptive understanding of the content, right? So again, we're thinking about the content, providing the appropriate language supports using the ELD standards as a scaffold for all of our English learners across the instructional day, across the content areas. So in a nutshell, these are some characteristics that describe the purpose and the goal of integrated ELD. Let's shift our attention to what is similar. Actually, I want to go with designated, and then we'll come back to what is similar. So let's focus our attention on designated ELD. So designated ELD, this is the language that is taught connected to the content area. So for designated ELD, we're talking about language, English language, how the English language works. What does it mean when I read this phrase as a result of? What does that mean? So again, really peeling back the content and focusing on the language and the meaning of language. So because of that, there is a language objective, right? Today we're going to learn about prepositional phrases and what that does to a sentence, what that does to a paragraph. The ELD standards are your focal standards. We're not using the language arts standards. We're not using the content standards. You're using a specific task that where students are engaging in their listening, speaking, reading, and writing skills. And it could be a piece of literature, it could be a poem, it could be unpacking a math problem, but you're not assessing on the math, on the poem, on the vocabulary. You're assessing, or rather progress monitoring, on how well the student is learning that element of English, how well the student is implementing that element of English in the context of the activity or task, and gauging their progress on that element of English. So the focus is strictly language development. And we know you can't teach language in a vacuum, so you absolutely have to use some content. The focus here, though, is the language and not the content. There is a specified time of day, each day, every day, throughout the instructional year. English learners are grouped by their proficiency level, and we're addressing the specific demands based on those proficiency levels. In other words, if I know that the groups of students that I'm working with during designated ELD are emerging level students, that first level of the language proficiency scale, oops, what happened? The first language of that language proficiency scale, if we know that to be true, then being aware of the ELD standards is going to help us determine what the student is able to do. In other words, students at the emerging level are still becoming very familiar with how language and words connect. And so a way for us to be able to gauge their progress would not be, a non-example would be asking them to write a paragraph, right? Rather, giving them a frame and asking them to fill in that language frame with words or phrases, because that is more in line with their language proficiency level. So again, being familiar with what students' language proficiency levels look like, what are some characteristics of that, and how the ELD standards play a role in helping me design the appropriate supports and instruction, both in designated and integrated ELD. Now let's call our attention to the middle section of this Venn diagram. What is similar? So what is similar? What is the same in integrated and designated ELD? Up at the top of that center section, the ELD standards. The ELD standards is the number one tool that we're going to use to design and deliver integrated and designated ELD. Not graphic organizers, not language frames, not visuals. Those are some of the supplemental resources that, based on our analysis of what the student is able to do, what are the challenges and where do they present themselves, listening, speaking, reading, and writing? And what is the goal of the standard? If it's math, what is the goal of the standard, and how am I going to use these language frames, these visuals, these graphic organizers, based on his proficiency level and what the standard is indicating they must do, right? So again, up at the top, the ELD standard is your number one tool in providing access to content and to language development for all of our English learners. Both designated and integrated ELD are designed to support English learners in that we're using the ELD standards and taking into consideration their language proficiency level. So by design, they're supports. And both of them are designed to develop the English language. In designated ELD, we're explicitly focusing on the forms and functions of the English language. What do these words and phrases represent? Meaning making, right? And what does that look like in context? In the context of this poem, in the context of this paragraph, in the context of this word problem, right? It's not dependent upon a program. So what does that mean? So if you are a teacher or an educator, a teacher or support provider or an administrator in a dual language program, designated and your English is your target language, you also have to implement comprehensive ELD, right? So just because you're in a dual language program or your kids are engaged in a dual language program doesn't mean that, okay, we're already learning two languages, we don't have to provide comprehensive ELD. Remember, folks, it is an entitlement, a federal entitlement for all English learners in the state of California. Those services are identified as comprehensive ELD, irregardless of the program, irregardless of the program. Rigorous content. Why is it rigorous content? Because it's standards-based, right? If it's not standards-based, again, we're missing the mark. So again, a qualified teacher, special education teacher, general education teacher, EL specialist, as long as we have the appropriate authorizations, which I would dare say the majority of us do, it's embedded in our teacher credentials, then we absolutely are able to provide this service as long as we're familiar with the tools that are afforded to us to be able to do it effectively, meaning understanding how to use the ELD standards. And they happen across disciplines. You're like, wait a minute, Lupita, you said that was only integrated ELD. Yes, but remember, folks, when we are focusing on building language skills via designated ELD, remember, that doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? When we're teaching and focusing on language development, English language development, you're going to be using content. Maybe it's social studies content, maybe it's math content, maybe it's science content, maybe it's physical education. Because we are using language, not in a vacuum, kids are learning the English language and the content in which they are engaging in to learn that English language. And guess what? They take that newfound language across the curriculum. It's language to go, right? It doesn't just live there and stay there. So we have to kind of shift our mindset that designated ELD happens here and it only happens here and it stays here, and everybody else has a different gig. We all have that responsibility, right? We all have that responsibility to teach language, to teach academic language, to teach academic English. And again, for those kiddos who are needing and who deserve and are entitled to EL services via comprehensive ELD, we must be familiar with the resources that are specifically designed to provide them with that specific support. Okay. Hopefully that helps kind of disentangle a little bit what comprehensive ELD is, where it lives and what is required of us and what is entitled to our English learners. Again, this activity is just to set some common understanding amongst ourselves. It's not an exhaustive list of what integrated and designated ELD is or isn't. But again, the purpose is for us to be able to develop some common understanding and start thinking about, okay, let's get to work. Is this what it looks like? If it isn't, what is our first next step to ensure that we are providing a comprehensive ELD, quality comprehensive ELD via the ELD standards for all of our English learners? Are there any questions either from our folks here in person or in the chat that we might need to clarify or address? Yes.
So Lupita, there's a question, and it's a often occurring one. What about SPED time? SDC classrooms, RSP classrooms, is that comprehensive ELD? So I think having walked through the Venn diagram should help answer that. That integrated ELD takes place throughout the day, and designated ELD is a separate time where the ELD standards are the focal standards. But I guess my response to that would be that if you are providing support, it's going to be related to those goals and objectives, what we covered for chapter 5, right? So can a special ed teacher provide ELD instruction? Absolutely, absolutely. But that SPED service time does not equal comprehensive ELD. So I guess that's the point that we want to make sure that is clear. Can designated ELD be provided by a special education teacher? Yes. However, those SPED minutes are not immediately equal to ELD minutes.
Yes, so we have a thank you for clarification in our live group. And just like special education services are not a place, neither are ELD services. So we really need to think about, and again, we appreciate these questions because these are reflective questions. And so engaging in these types of reflective thinking is going to help us really pinpoint what we need to do, what we need to address, what we need to change, right? So if we don't, then we just keep doing what we're doing and we keep getting what we're getting. And unless we're 1,000% happy and know that our kids are thriving and receiving all the services that they deserve and need, then, at what point do we get there? We don't. In education, we are driven by the needs of the students. And our students have dynamic, diverse needs just by the nature of who we're referring to. Our English learners, not a monolith, right? Depending on their level of literacy in their primary language, depending on the level of instruction, of English instruction that they've received, schooling, so many factors that play a role into what they're able to bring to the table, what they know but can't show, and then how do we match that? How do we provide the appropriate support so that they can all thrive? Again, complex, but not impossible. And again, this is why we encourage all practitioners, general education, special education, educators, leaders, specialists, to come together at the table and learn together these resources, these state and federal mandates, so that we're literally all on the same page and are able to divide and conquer, if you will, right? To join our forces, our expertise, our knowledge, our experience, again, for the sole goal and purpose of providing access, equity, and appropriate supports for English learners with disabilities so that they can make gains and meet their goals and are happy to come to school, know that they are thriving, and know that they can contribute and grow and thrive. Okay. So hopefully we have a better understanding, a clearer understanding, a common understanding of some of the characteristics between designated and integrated ELD, what's different, what's the same. But I also want us to consider how the student manifests their learning of content through their development of English language acquisition. So this graphic can be found in figure 6.3 of the practitioner's guide, and it really is just an image of what language acquisition may look like. Again, not exhaustive, but it's important for us to take note that when an English learner is gradually progressing through their language acquisition stages as they're acquiring English, some skills may be acquired a little faster than others, right? Sometimes some students may further develop their listening skills much quicker than their writing skills, right? But it's really challenging for us to be able to pick up on what's happening in their brains, which is why it's imperative that we become more and more familiar with what that might look like. And also, on top of that, when an English learner with a disability is also acquiring those different language skills, it may manifest in a similar way, right? And we may, I'm speaking specifically about English learners who we may not know are in need of special education services yet, right? So the trajectory of their learning based on the challenges that they're presenting due to a disability may also manifest in a way that typical English language acquisition manifest. So again, it's important for us to know and understand language acquisition as it pertains to English learners, and then how might that look, and those gray areas for English learners with disabilities. So again, really important for us to understand deeply, right, what English language acquisition is. And if you are not the expert, then lean on the experts. They exist. They exist at your site. They exist in your district level. So again, going back to the dynamic of our team, it's very intentional, right? It's very intentional. I'm thankful that you guys aren't leaning on me for your special education questions. That's not my area of expertise. This is where I refer to Christina and Vanessa and Debbie, because they are the experts in that area. And whenever there is a need for clarification on, let's say, the ELD standards, then my friends, my colleagues lean on me. So we work together, we work collaboratively to be able to provide you with the resources and supports that we know are going to be best practices when implemented well. So again, reach out to your colegas, to your colleagues in respect to that. We have another question in the chat.
So this is a great question for clarification. So what I'm hearing is that SPED teachers can teach designated ELD, but they don't have to teach designated ELD if the gen ed teacher is providing designated ELD support to the student already, correct?
That is correct. But again, you want to make sure that we're taking into consideration the least restrictive environment for your English learner. And again, also English models. So again, the IEP team will make that determination. Where is the best, where might designated ELD be best served, whether it's in the general education or special education teacher, who is going to teach it, and where might it be the best opportunity for the student to gain English language skills. I hope that clarifies and addresses the questions. And thank you, we appreciate the questions, keep them coming, because that's how we learn. Okay, we need a mic over here. I'm gonna let you borrow mine. Okay, it's coming. Because our Zoom friends need to hear the question too.
Just, okay, so for the ELD, my understanding is if we can justify that it's linked to their disability, then we can say that it's a designated, something that we can provide within the special ed setting, right? Because then it will be SPED minutes. So then we have to account those minutes. So then at least restrictive environments, the percentage is increasing, so, right?
Okay, so just for, and we'll absolutely hand it over to Vanessa, but just to clarify, the fact that the student is an English learner is not a disability, okay? So just for the group, just to clarify for the group, and this is why we're here, to kind of disentangle and recognize that there may be shades of gray, but we have to be clear. Because the students are English learners, right? They have an IEP, but because they are English learners, they absolutely must receive comprehensive ELD, designated and integrated. If the disability manifest in such a way that designated ELD is going to be best served with supports provided during the special education service time, then the IEP team will make that determination based on what the student is able to do and the challenges that are being presented. The special ed minutes question, or part of your question, I'm going to refer that to Vanessa.
So it's a great question because we really were considering the least restrictive environment. So if you remember when I was covering the slides for chapter 5, I showed you LRE considerations for intervention time and ELD time. So gen ed students, oh, there we go, see? Oh my goodness. So the initial consideration is what? General education, always first. Remember, we start there, not from the bottom and have them graduate on up. That's applicable here too. So if the student is receiving designated ELD instruction in the general education setting, perfect if they're making adequate progress. But as Lupita mentioned, if the team determines that they will be best served during their service minutes, then absolutely. Now, does that have implications for minutes? Absolutely as well, because you're using that time to work on what? Your goals. That is your primary role, to work on those goals that are linguistically appropriate. Now, if you're going to add 30 minutes of designated ELD instruction, 40 minutes of ELD instruction, that's a determination made by the IEP team. And again, if you're adding minutes, that's going to be reflected in your service minutes and your percentage of time. Other ways that it's been done, and again, I come from a K-6 setting, I'm sharing my experience. In a K-6 setting, we had ELD exchange time. We had 40 minutes. I don't know why everybody does 40 minutes, but we had 40 minutes, and then we would exchange by level. And being the benevolent irritant that I am, I would ensure that my students were included in Gen Ed ELD exchange time. Why? Because they're already grouped by proficiency level.
And language models.
And language models. So if you are in that position to push, push. If you're not, talk to people who can help you push, if appropriate, always. Going back to the individual, if appropriate.
Thanks,
Soapbox,
Vanessa.
done.
Right. I'm going to take our attention back to the California values for addressing the needs of English learners with disabilities. One of them was the implementation of UDL, right? So the implementation of UDL is not a special education element, right? It happens across, right? So when we think about the supports and what UDL looks like, what effective UDL looks like, when implemented well in your Tier 1 core instruction, it's an automatic scaffold or support for all of your learners. When we're talking about our English learners, their linguistic supports can be added based on their language proficiency level. Those supports may already exist. They just may need to be tweaked to address what they're able to do linguistically, right? So write a sentence as opposed to a paragraph. Let's just give you that example, based on their language proficiency level. So again, we have to take into consideration the entire context, right? So I understand that as a special education practitioner, you have your scope of work, right? And so, and like Vanessa says, it's important for us to live in our scope of work, to, what we often refer to as silos. However, let's build bridges between our silos, right? You need to be the expert as special education teachers, which is why I refer my SPED questions to Vanessa, right? I'm not going to pretend that I know how to answer that accurately, effectively, and from experience. So we build bridges between our silos because we need the EL experts. We need the general education experts. We need the special education experts, but we do need to build these bridges, these back and forth communication, two-way communication, to be able, again, to join what we lovingly call our superpowers. Again, all for the purpose of addressing the very unique and dynamic and complex needs of our ELs with disabilities. Fantastic questions. This is why we like in person, because we're able to engage with you more personally and address the questions on the go. Same with those of you joining us via Zoom. We'll continue to pose your questions out loud as appropriate and as best we can, address them as best that we can. So thank you for engaging with us that way. So let's talk a little bit about some best practices to help support a more effective, efficient, comprehensive ELD implementation. So many of you are familiar with co-teaching and understand that there are several co-teaching models. I want to also plug that we do have a co-teaching session coming up in March. We'll find the flyer and drop it in the chat for those of you joining us via Zoom. It's important for us to share all the things that we're doing, and it's just coming to my mind right now. So join us for a co-teaching session in March. Vanessa, do me that favor, and then we'll make sure to share the flyer with our in-person participants. So back to co-teaching. So there are different models for co-teaching. What I want you to know is that both designated and integrated ELD happen in all of the co-teaching models. Again, taking into consideration the type of model that you are implementing or thinking about implementing, ask yourself that question. What does integrated ELD look like during this co-teaching model? What does designated ELD look like during this co-teaching model? Or is that, or where is it happening? So I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes. Let's do about 4 minutes on the clock to help you become familiar with the different co-teaching models, please keeping in mind the role of comprehensive ELD in each of the models. If you are implementing one of these models, be reflective of what it looks like and what and where is comprehensive ELD happening. So we're going to put 4 minutes on the clock, spend some time with figure 6.11, and then we'll field any clarifying questions, or if you have some insights based on your implementation of these co-teaching models, please share. So we'll do 4 minutes on the clock. So hopefully you had enough time to become familiar with this document. And we really appreciate it because, again, it's a one-pager of different models of co-teaching with descriptions and some advantages. So when I read through this resource, I'm often taken back to my very first year as a general education teacher, and just to shine some light on the reason why different models may be appropriate depending on the setting. This is why I want to share this story. My very first teaching assignment was in first grade, and back then, we had at mid-year, we had just implemented the 20-to-1 ratio in first grade, and I'm aging myself a little bit. And so at mid-year, they hired another first grade teacher to provide the support needed, right, to go 20-to-1. But we didn't have another classroom for her, so she landed in my classroom, right, low man on totem pole, which was such a blessing. I mean, to this day, it was just phenomenal opportunity for us to learn from each other and, understand what instruction could look like, when given opportunities to think outside the box. So we instinctively started to co-teach. So let me share just a little bit of the dynamic of that setting. So I was hired because I hold a bilingual credential. And so that particular school was in need of hiring more BCLAD credentialed teachers to, offer the support that was needed for their incoming kiddos who were English learners. So that was why I was hired. And then my friend, who is still very close, we're very, very close friends now, bonded very quickly that first year. She was hired to provide support for our gifted and talented population of kiddos. So that was the dynamic of our classroom. We shared a 7th grade lab classroom. I can't help but to smile, when I think about that, because again, such a wonderful opportunity for us new teachers to learn and lean on each other and, just what do they need? What do they need? Let's put them together. Let's separate them. I think we went through every single model on this resource as we were trying our very best, being new teachers, to meet the needs of the dynamic of our kiddos. And even though she had her own roster and I had my own roster, there were times where we brought them together. There were times where we needed them to be separately. There were times where we were like literally tag teaming each other coming in and out of instruction. I maybe it looked like a hot mess, but I can tell you that we were able to be reflective with each other and identify, yeah, no, we're not going to do that again. Or yes, we're going to keep doing that, but we're going to add this tweak. And so I consider it a blessing. It might have been a nightmare, or maybe I just didn't know. I didn't know what I didn't know. And again, that was a blessing. What do they say? Ignorance is bliss. But again, taking into consideration the needs of your students, the students that you're thinking about, and also the environment, right? So the context of your site, the context of your department, because co-teaching really requires vulnerability and trust. And that was inherent. Both my colega and I, being new teachers, we didn't know what we didn't know. We were just trying to figure things out and really gauging our effectiveness based on how well the kids were learning or not, and making the appropriate adjustments. So depending on which co-teaching model you are implementing or thinking about implementing, think about all the moving parts. What is the culture of the site or the department, so that you know which model might you want to start with, right? What are some of the resources that are already being implemented, or maybe some site-based goals or strategies that are being implemented, and how are you going to weave those into this model? Who might be a good partner with you? Or if you're an administrator, who are you thinking about might be good collaborators, right? So again, different models. These are great ways to provide access, but also to build common understanding between general education and special education, so that again we begin to build these bridges between our very much needed expertise silos, right? We don't want to do away with the silos. I so appreciate when Vanessa shares this with us, because they're needed, they're important. There's value in really focusing in on your area of expertise and continuing to do it and do it well. However, we can expand that expertise so that all of our kids benefit from it by building bridges between these expert silos, right? Okay, so I don't know if there are any questions or insights in the chat that we want to highlight and share out with our group, and the same with our in-person folks. Your thoughts on co-teaching, things that you've seen, things that you've implemented, what worked, what are some challenges, what are some insights based on this? Because again, these models will provide access when we're given some thoughtful thinking about how to best implement and which model to best implement.
We have a couple of questions that I think we can answer towards the end. One specific to ELD support in the community, and then another one related to adult transition programs and ELD supports. And I think once we cover 6 and 7, we can circle back and talk about that very, very, very important part of our IEP process for our students as they're aging out of services, those transition programs and supports in the community.
Testing, there we go. Okay, so we will circle back to those two and make sure that we address them. So this resource, Vanessa introduced it to us. It plays an integral role in us being able to provide the appropriate resources that students are going to need to access our assessments. However, if these resources are being implemented only during the time the student is taking these assessments, then it may become a hindrance or a barrier. Right, so it's important for students to become familiar with the tools that we have identified are going to be appropriate and necessary, so that the assessments are accessible and they can be able to truly show what they know. So again, the universal tools, designated supports, and whatever identified accommodations that we've identified are necessary for the students, they should be part of our daily instruction, because by design, they are accessibility tools, right? Hence the title. So let's not only be intentional about identifying what the best ones are for the assessments, let's begin to implement them in our daily instruction as well. And again, bringing back these resources, these are wonderful resources to help us pinpoint, right, and document what the student absolutely needs by domain. What are the supports the student needs in their listening, speaking, reading, writing domains? And then match them to the range of resources that our accessibility system has already identified, right? So it's just a matter of bringing these resources together and lining them up and not thinking and wondering, well, what do I use and how do I know? Again, a great way to come together as a team, as a department, as an IEP team, as a grade level team, as a gen ed sped team, when you are talking about providing access and appropriate supports for English learners with disabilities. Again, we can't talk about access, quality access, and equity without progress monitoring, because how will we know? How will we know that the student is making adequate progress if we're not doing a stop and check? Right? And that can look in very many different ways. They could be formal or informal opportunities to assess student progress. You could sit down with the kiddo and ask, how's this working for you? What do you like about it? How do you best learn? How do you think you best learn? They'll tell you, right? And also, of course, the formal, because we need evidence for progress monitoring to be able to not only justify, but truly identify the tools that we need to implement to best serve the students' needs, linguistic and special education service needs. So again, progress monitoring is key. Implementing a resource, collecting some data, analyzing that data, tweaking it whenever necessary. And again, always keeping into consideration the student's linguistic needs as it relates to the disability. Again, it's not either or, it's both. So circling back to one of our state resources, or California policy, in this case, the English Learner Roadmap. This figure 6.15 is a reflection tool that we really appreciate. Again, as we stated earlier today, the type of support, the training, the resources that we provide are tools designed to help us reflect, to help us think about our current practices, to help us think about our current policies, and do our practices match the policies, or which do we need to refine? So we appreciate reflection tools. So the EL Roadmap has a English Learner Roadmap reflection tool which takes all 4 principles. Principle 1, right, an asset-based approach. Element E speaks specifically to ELs with disabilities. So I invite you to become familiar with this reflection tool, because it's going to guide a conversation, dialogue that will lead to some actionable next steps, again, to refine and align our practices to better support the needs of our kiddos. So hopefully sometime before the end of the day, or before the end of your day, not necessarily your day with us, you'll have some time to revisit some of these tools. And again, everything is accessible via the slide deck as well as the Padlet for easy access. And then another document that we want to share with you, again, providing equitable access. What is the least restrictive environment? I know there's been a few questions both on the Zoom and in person regarding LRE and ELD. And so again, it merits us taking advantage of the tools that are created specifically to help us to do that well, right? To be in line with state and federal mandates. And most importantly, to provide students the most appropriate, equitable, respectful environment for their learning. So again, another tool for you to help us identify what is the least restrictive environment, and do like a gauge of where we are. Are we including these elements of the LRE in addressing the needs of our students? Whew, that was chapter 6 in a nutshell. just in time for lunch too. So I'm gonna invite you in the Zoom room and those of you here to just take about 3 minutes, 5 minutes to just kind of let the dust settle a little bit. Vanessa walked you through the key considerations of an IEP for an English learner. I walked you through some different resources and considerations for providing the access and equity for your English learners. So if you're here with us, just jot some notes down about what resonated with you, right? What do you feel like, okay, that validates my thinking or my practice? And also some questions that you may need some clarification on, or maybe questions for yourself. You know, when I get back, I need to look for, or I need to ask for, or whatever, right? So again, this is all about being reflective so that we can take the appropriate next steps to work smarter, not harder. So it'll take about 2 to 3 minutes. Jot down some new learnings and some wonderings, and we will circle back in just a couple of minutes, and we will break for lunch. So as we wrap up chapter 6, and as we get ready to take a much needed, well-deserved lunch break, I want to do an open mic session with our in-person folks to see if there's anything that you would like to share based on your new learnings or wonderings for us here and for our friends at Zoom. And then I'll come back and take a look at our learnings and wonderings on the Zoom chat as well, or Christina, if you can read them out to us if some are popping in. So new learnings or new wonderings? Thank you, Lupe. I think it's on.
Okay, so for me, since I've been out of the classroom for so many years, what really resonates to me is the comprehensive, so the integrated and designated. So I really learned a lot about, you know, what model, or when we blend it in together, the expectations. So I think this is very, very informative for me. Also on the co-teaching, because that is something that I do with my teachers, the different types of modeling. Even though I think we do all of them sometimes, like we don't specifically have a name for it. Now I feel like, oh, I have a name for this now. So it's a new learning for me. And questions, I have a lot of questions, but I mean, I have to put all this information together first. But thank you. It was very informative, everything.
Thank you, Lupe. Anybody else in the group that would like to share new learning or wondering? Thank you.
Well, for me, it was kind of like an eye-opener where we need to go back to our districts and really start asking questions about how we will help our students, you know, do better in these areas, and how we're going to get a group of people, because I can see now that it's not just SPED teachers that have to do with this. So
Right.
how are we going to get admin involved, our technology, you know, personnel? And how are you going to better serve our students and giving them all the tools that they're going to need to be successful?
Thank you. Any wonderings? Whether they're, you know, of us or the content, or maybe personal wonderings, like I'm wondering who I meet, who needs to be here, or I'm wondering who do I need to connect with to share this information with. So hopefully this is taking you to that place, right? Questions are good and we welcome them, especially when we ask them of ourselves, right? So that we recognize that there absolutely is room to grow, because our kids deserve it. They're entitled to it. And this is what we signed up to do, right? And so because it is our moral imperative and a civil right to provide access and equitable education for all of our students, we need to reflect on where we stand and where is there room to grow. So on that note, let's take a well-deserved lunch break. I'm looking at our clock here. It says 11:36. Please come back at 12:40. We'll just give you a couple extra minutes just to round it up. We'll reconvene at 12:40 to cover the last chapter of section 3, which is chapter 7. So thank you so much. See you in an hour. Drive safely. Enjoy your lunch.
All right, everybody, welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully your lunch was an enjoyable one. You got to take use of more than 15 minutes to eat your meal, hopefully. And let's get started. Let's jump right into it. We're going to start off with Chapter 7, again, part of Section 3 of our Practitioner's Guide. Chapter 7 specifically focuses in on all things teaching and learning to meet student needs. So here we're really tying it all together, from the development of that IEP for English learners with disabilities, to then looking at instructional programming as Lupita walked us through the different components, and now finally looking at it through the lens of teaching and learning, putting it all together. So we're looking at academic content, ELD, disability-related needs, social emotional learning needs of our students who are dually identified. We're also looking at their IEP, specifically the goals to inform instruction. So we're going to go back to that conversation related to goals that are linguistically appropriate. For our admin friends joining in today, we're going to take a look as to how do we ensure that they are receiving the instruction that they need? What might quality instruction look like? And how can we best support teachers to provide this instruction? And how will I know if the instruction is effective? As always, we include this chapter infographic to support your learning needs, all related to Chapter 7. Chapter 7, again, the infographic is there available for you to be able to follow along with some of the content that we have been covering today and will continue to cover related to Chapter 7 specifically. Chapter 7, as I already alluded to, is all about teaching and learning practices, really tying it all together, putting it together to make academic, English language, and social emotional learning progress for all of our students. So if you've been with us since Chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, earlier today, 5, and 6, you'll notice that this has been a gradual build, starting with the establishment of educational benefit, looking at universal design for learning, the tiers of instruction, and comprehensive ELD. All the guidelines, supports, programs, and frameworks remain the absolute same, regardless of the level of specialized support provided through the IEP process. Let me explain what that means. So when we looked at the identification of students as potential English learners, and then finally going through the MTSS process, also looking at pre-referral activities, and then finally when students are assessed and they meet eligibility criteria, we want to ensure that they retain core instruction. Core instruction is inclusive of comprehensive ELD. I want to make sure that we highlight that just because they are receiving special education services doesn't mean that they are exempt from comprehensive ELD instruction. ELD is core, general, guaranteed instruction. It's not a tier 2 support, it's not a tier 3 support, it's not special education. ELD is core. Considerations surrounding universal design for learning are also important. What do UDL guidelines ask us to do? Multiple means of expression, engagement, and representation. Going back to our discussion around LPAC, when we're looking at listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and the supports necessary, linguistic supports, those have a place in UDL as well. How are we making content comprehensible? How are we allowing students to demonstrate what they are learning? Multiple means of expression. The tiers of instruction also are a continual support. A student that qualifies for special education services still retains access to core, and if necessary, intervention supports through the tiers of instruction. Comprehensive ELD, again, as we already stated, core, consistent. Lupita walked us through the circles of implementation and called out how language is at the core of all content learning. And setting up effective contexts for learning, we're looking at language development. We're looking at meaning making, effective expression, foundational skills, and content knowledge. Looking outside on that orange band, that is the end result. Readiness for college, careers and civic life, capacities of literate individuals, broadly literate, and being able to participate fully with 21st century skills. The IEP provides a pathway to do that when developed appropriately, when considering all elements related to English learners. And it can be easy to say, right? Like, well, we must do this in order to get that. Well, what is the this and what is the that, right? When we're looking at general, core instruction, UDL lives there. Those of us familiar with UDL know that it came out of the world of architecture, being inclusive of all users, and now it's found a place in academia. For a while, those of us in special education have been talking UDL for quite a few years already. I want you to put on your EL lens, your multilingual learner lens, and your special education teacher support provider lens. When we look at providing access through recruiting interest, sustaining effort and persistence, self-regulation, what might some of those supports look like? And are these not in alignment with accessibility resources? Might these be linguistic supports that are present during core instruction? When we're looking at multiple means of representation, the what of learning, in relation to accessibility resources, what might our options that we provide be for perception, for language and symbols, for comprehension? Action and expression. These are the strategic networks that our students use to show the how of learning. What are the options, what are the supports that we provide for physical action, expression and communication, and executive functions? If we look at it through this lens, all of the dots start connecting. And we start realizing that one of the phrases Lupita and I use often is that it's not one more thing, it's the same thing, and it's the only thing. So utilizing your understanding of accessibility resources, of appropriate linguistic supports, of the diversity of our learners, of their jagged learner profile with relative strengths and relative weaknesses, the stronger our core instruction is, inclusive of the UDL guidelines, the more encompassing it'll be to support a true multi-tiered system of support that is inclusive of our English learners. There's a lot of conversation around the MTSS system, but if you want to know what is most important for me to take away from this conversation right now specific to the MTSS and English learners is that Tier 3 is not SPED. Okay, oftentimes we get that question, well, you know, when we get them to Tier 3, that's when they qualify for special education. That is not the case. Tier 1 is universal core instruction. Tier 2 is short-term supplemental instruction that is strategic and targeted. We often get the comment of, oh, we have so many kids in Tier 2. So many in Tier 2, and then we have so many in Tier 3. I would invite you to pause and go back to that Tier 1 instruction. That is what might need revisiting. And I say revisiting because I'm not going to say to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I'm going to invite you to take a look at existing practices and if they truly are effective for the learners that you have in your room, in your classroom, wherever it is that you're providing services. Always important to go back to Tier 1. Always, always, always go back to Tier 1 and look at it with a critical eye. Not with a critical eye to lay blame, but to reflect and to build. So Lupita really took us deep into comprehensive ELD. And it bears repeating because the more we hear it, the more we remember it. I know that's the case with me. Integrated ELD, if you recall, is regular class time where the ELD standards work in tandem with the focal standards. Designated ELD is that separate, protected time for the ELD standards as the focal standards. So what I want you to think about it now is think about your linguistically appropriate goals. Let's look at it through the lens of integrated ELD and designated ELD. What are your linguistically appropriate goals? Are they integrated or designated? It's integrated, right? Because we're developing goals that are based on grade level content standards. We're considering linguistic supports necessary. So the ELD standards are being considered in tandem with the content area standards. So again, not saying that by having a goal that is linguistically appropriate, you are in fact providing designated ELD. That's not what I'm saying. Remember, we want to be clear that designated ELD must be a separate time of instruction that isn't necessarily synonymous with your special education minutes. Completely different. In continuing the conversation around effective contexts for learning, it's important for us to take a look at as many resources that support us in meeting the needs of culturally and linguistically diverse students. In setting these effective contexts, we want to ensure that we are practicing cultural and linguistic knowledge of the home and community experiences. Integrating the history and cultures of our students, again, that engagement, to recruit engagement. And we also want to promote healthy perceptions of the various cultures and linguistic diversity that is in our classroom and focusing on issues of social justice. Again, these are effective contexts for learning, for engaging with all students if we truly want to engage in culturally and linguistically responsive and sustaining pedagogy. Earlier, we talked about the dimensions of identity. When we see our students in our classroom, it's important for us to recognize that they aren't just a student with an IEP. They aren't just a student who's an English learner. They bring multiple assets and experiences into our classroom. From the dimensions of identity linked up here, culture, ethnicity, disability, race, sexuality, gender, amongst others, we must recognize that we are working with individuals. And we should work towards validating, affirming, building, and bridging the VAB framework. So the English Learner Roadmap is inclusive of all English learners, inclusive of all of their dimensions of identity, and working towards validating, affirming, building, and bridging. That is how we began establishing an effective context for teaching and learning. When we talk about the MTSS framework, we often focus on just the academic component of it, but we know that it's also inclusive of social emotional learning and positive behaviors. So figure 7.3, again, in continuing our conversation on effective context for learning, also talks about the guiding principles for our state social emotional learning. Whole child focused, commitment to equity, capacity building, family and community partnerships, as well as learning and improving what it is that we are doing. Heeding those calls to action and making sure that whenever we engage in reflective practices of existing processes, procedures, etc., we are following up with actionable next steps. And these steps can be as large or as small as you need, but again, reflecting on current practices and reflecting on current climate. So I know oftentimes we think about MTSS as just Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. However, there are additional relevant topics specific to the California MTSS and English learners. This white sheet put out by Orange County Department of Ed, CDE, Swift, and Butte County has a sheet focused specifically on the needs of English learners and one on connecting the dots for students with disabilities. So meeting the needs of English learners in California, meeting the needs of students with disabilities, it's interesting that here it's linked as two different topics, but really in our world, in the state of California, those of us that work with students with disability know that a high percentage of our caseload is absolutely right there at the intersection of disability and language acquisition. So both elements apply. I invite you to take a look at figure 7.7 deeply so that you can have a little bit more context as to how the MTSS framework applies for these two student populations. We all believe, which is why we're here, sitting here in person, joining us in Zoom, that all English learners with disabilities, like any other student, are able to attain content standards. But we also recognize that specialized supports are absolutely necessary. Not if I can provide it that day I will, but absolutely necessary. And planning ahead of time to ensure that these are consistently available and applicable is our job. And if we need support doing that, we should ask. So we are going to share a video with you. This is Shelly Moore, and we love Shelly Moore. She has the most interesting bits of info that she shares and gives perspectives and a new lens to looking at something that might seem commonplace to us. So we're going to take a couple of minutes, play this video, and I want you to watch with a purpose. And the purpose is for you to take in what she's saying, connect to what we've talked about this morning and during this short segment right after lunch. I know the lunch coma is real, so I'm going to let you listen to Shelly for a bit and be ready to think about and share what resonated with you and how it has implications to your teaching and your students' learning. Let me step on up here, try not to trip. Entertaining for you, not so much for me. And here we go.
To 5 more minutes. Useful videos in about 5 minutes that support the teaching and learning of all students. I'm your host, Shelly Moore, and today's episode is called Reducing the Barriers, Planning for All. Okay, everyone, today we're talking about something very important. Today we're talking about shifting a paradigm. Now, one thing that I'm not sure everybody realizes is that in our efforts to move towards more inclusion and equity in our schools is that one of the biggest barriers is the actual infrastructure of the existing educational model. You see, me, like many of us who work in education, we were taught how to support students through a special education lens. That is, a model where a plan is made for most students and then special support is offered to those students who don't have success in that original plan. This special support then seeks to figure out, well, what's wrong with the student in question, and then offers support in a way by offering adaptations and modifications so that they can fit into the first plan. But what if nobody fits into the plan? Because of how we were all taught to support students, as our classrooms have become more diverse, there's been this overwhelming feeling that inclusion is so much work because more and more students need this type of retrofit support in order to be successful. Okay, now listen, I have never met a teacher that can follow more than one plan. So a big question emerging here is, how do we make one plan for all learners from the start so that we can be effective and efficient and then not have to retrofit for all of the learners that don't fit. In order to do this, we need to shift how we think about and respond to students who are struggling. You see, special education evolved out of a medical model. So for example, like if you break your leg, you go to the doctor and then they fix you. And if they can't fix you, they send you to a specialist. We get medical attention when something is wrong. This is special education. It's designed to react to students when something is wrong. And as a result, our educational system has become so heavily reliant on processes that emphasize failure, expensive evaluations, and intervention systems that focus on the deficits in students. Well, something that we can learn from the disability community is that just because a person is struggling doesn't mean they're broken. People don't need to be fixed. So then how do we respond to students in a way that meets their needs without creating programs and following processes for only targets what's wrong? Well, I will tell you this. We need to move away from the medical model, that's for sure. So what can we do instead? Well, one alternative is to shift towards a social model. In a social model, if someone isn't having success, it's not because they have a disability or because something's wrong with them as an individual, but instead it's because there's something around them in the context that's limiting their success. Now listen, I spend a lot of time traveling, mostly throughout North America, but about 2 years ago I had the opportunity to speak at a conference in Hong Kong. Now I was so excited about this. I've never been to Hong Kong, so my wife and I, we packed our bags and we were ready to go on our great Hong Kong adventure. Well, I was so excited that I didn't really anticipate that I would have different needs in Hong Kong than I do in North America. Typically, I would feel pretty independent in my travels. I would rent a car, I would drive, no problem. I would be able to navigate conversations and menus and directions and be able to find the conference hall that I'm presenting in, easy peasy. But in Hong Kong, I realized I needed much more support to be able to do these very similar things. Like I wasn't able to rent a car. I didn't have the right driver's license. I wasn't able to have many conversations, read menus, or follow directions because there was a language barrier. I also had no idea where I was speaking because I couldn't read any of the conference signs. I needed a lot of support in Hong Kong. Thank goodness the organization who brought me there anticipated this and made 3 Hong Kong EAs available to me if I needed them. I had a driver, I had a translator, I had a host, but I couldn't help think to myself, like, that's so many resources for one person. What's important to know about this example is that whether I'm in North America or whether I'm in Hong Kong, I'm still the same person. My success and independence in Hong Kong had very little to do with me as an individual and had more to do with the barriers that existed around me. Now, I want you to imagine all the students that you work with, every teacher they interact with, every classroom and school they go to. I want you to think about all these different contexts as possible different countries. Students are the same regardless of where they go. What changes is the context around them, and every context is going to have more or less barriers that can either support or limit success. So how do we support kids this way? Well, first of all, we have to anticipate these barriers, which means we can't wait for students to not be successful. We can't wait for them to fail. Second, we have to stop putting all of our resources into trying to fix individuals. If we move away from this kind of student diagnosis and intervention as the first strategy, it allows us to assess the environment and the context first to find out what's getting in the way. Because the big idea here is this, my friends. The more we support a context to reduce barriers, the less individual resources a person will need to be successful. The social model of support is a foundational understanding to planning for all students and directly connects to universal design for learning, response to instruction, and collaborative models of support. It would be very difficult to try and implement any of these frameworks if we were only looking at students through a medical and deficit-based perspective. Students are not broken. They may need support, but today's challenge is asking, instead, look around a student to see how can we fix the context so that barriers are reduced instead of looking at what we can do to fix a student in their deficit area. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of 5 More Minutes. Make sure you take a look at the 5 More Minutes podcast where we dig deeper into some of these big ideas. Give us a like. Don't forget to subscribe. You don't want to miss any of these episodes. I'll see you next time.
Let's time travel, my friends. Let's go back in time. So Shelley talked about the different contexts Let me fix this. Universal design for learning being critical. Setting up from the get-go to be successful. When we look at UDL, multiple means of engagement, representation, action, and expression. When we're considering the linguistic support needs that our students might require, chances are those linguistic supports aren't helpful just for them, but for others as well. And if those are included within your day-to-day planning, within your day-to-day instruction, more of your students will be successful. And I'm not talking about students once they're in special education, I'm talking about general education. Are our walls accessible in our classroom? What are some of the embedded resources available in the environment? How are we setting up from the get-go? Are we allowing students opportunities to engage with tasks in ways that are meaningful for them, and to others as well? Are we supporting the discovery of what type of learner they are as well? All of these elements are consistently implemented in Tier 1, but also Tier 2 and Tier 3 instruction. They don't stop. Yes, easier said than done. Absolutely a huge lift in the beginning. But just being reflective in these practices will help you start making changes one bit at a time. I always invite you to approach change in the chunks that are manageable to you. Don't be overwhelmed, little bit at a time. Because really, the end result is an effective context for learning for all students. When we are looking at the needs of English learners and English learners with disabilities, we recognize that specialized supports are required. However, what would happen? Let's wonder together, let's dream together. What would happen if some of those supports were embedded already throughout our day? And if you need them, use them. If you don't, that's fine. Shelley's video always makes me reflect in my experiences as a traveler. I love traveling. And the first time I watched this video, I thought of one thing. The showers in Europe are so small. Those of you in Zoom can't really tell, but I'm like almost 6 foot tall. And my wingspan is huge. So showering was a challenge. Just getting under the shower head itself, I had to do this number, crouch a little, to make sure that I was getting water where I needed to get water. I had to turn like this. It was such a limiting context, such a limiting environment. And it wasn't something I enjoyed. It was a chore. Necessary, but a chore. So when I watched this video, I thought about that and all of my experiences in that regard. And I don't even need to go across the pond for that. Just going to a new environment. Think of the first time you went to a fancy restaurant, right? Ooh, so many forks, which one? Right? It's a new context. If you have somebody guiding you, that's great. But if you don't, right? So again, please chime in with your feedback related to any salient points that Shelley shared with us or how you related to your teaching and learning or your own experience so that we can continue, again, reflecting and tying it all together in relation to effective contexts for learning. That being said, I'm going to hand it over to Lupita so that she can take us on the home stretch.
Okay, folks. So I'm actually going to go back to one slide. As you're kind of processing all the information that we've shared with you up to this point, running from chapter 5, 6, and now as we are kind of sort of midway point in some of the key elements of chapter 7, and how this video clip kind of captures that thinking that Our approach in sharing these resources with you in our work and our scope of work through this grant is, again, to help transform our current practices to be more intentional, using all the recommended and required resources and mandates, again, to help us address a very specific and unique needs of the population of the students we're referring to. So as you're consistently processing this information, thinking about what applies to you directly, where might you need to connect with somebody or a team or an office, what the leadership lens is, if you're an administrator and you hold a specific responsibility to provide training and support to staff, where are we? Where are we in our own trajectory of transforming our current systems and practices so that we are better able to meet the needs of our students? So again, this constant reflective process of utilizing the tools and information that we're sharing with you, whether it's new or not, where we are today and how do we move forward. So let's go back to one of the features that we really appreciate from the practitioner's guide, which is the FAQ feature. So let's start with this question. And I feel like that up to this point, I think we're all going to get an A on this answer. So do English learners with disabilities need to have designated ELD? What do you guys say in the room here with me? Show me with your thumbs up, thumbs down. Yeah, right? So I think up to this point, we all pretty much understand that comprehensive ELD, which includes designated and integrated ELD, is a requirement of all English learners, right? Federal entitlement EL services for all English learners, including English learners with disabilities. So it's important for us to, number one, understand what comprehensive ELD looks like, designated and integrated, understand the resources, the ELD standards, to the degree that we are using them to design and deliver instruction, and that we're able to lean on our colleagues to support, to better support the needs of our English learners via their English learner services. So yes, all English learners, including English learners with disability, receive both integrated and designated ELD instruction. So it's critical, again, critical that we are all using these resources, and if we're not familiar with them, to inquire about training or request support or both from your administrators and colleagues as well. So because we know that comprehensive ELD is a requirement, it's critical that we understand how the standards are organized and to help us better utilize them in our design and delivery. So this image captures the organization of the ELD standard. So I'm going to walk you through the different elements of the ELD standards, again, to kind of help us paint a more concrete picture of how the ELD standards are organized and why they are organized the way that they are. I've been in education for almost 30 years now, and when I started as a classroom teacher, we didn't have any standards, not just ELD standards, but any standards. I actually came on right before the content standards were launched. So shortly after that, not so shortly, but a few years after that, the first iteration of the ELD standards were pushed out. These ELD standards have been around for 10 years now. And I can tell you from having focused on English learners right from the beginning of my educational career to my 20 plus years at the county office, folks are still wondering, like, what is this resource and how do I use it? So I laugh, but it's not funny. It's not funny. It's just, it gives me more of a sense of urgency to continue to do this work because it's necessary, right? So what I really want you to know is that by design, our 2012 ELD standards are organized in such a way that it really enables us, the practitioners, to understand how to use them and see how they relate to the content standards, how they directly correlate to a cluster of content standards. And that's what I'm going to attempt to do today, is to just give you a broad overview of the organization of the ELD standards so that we can begin to see how important it is for us to be able to use them to implement both designated and integrated ELD. So let's take a look at this image, and you'll notice right away that there are 3 distinct parts called out. So I'm going to walk you through part by part. So the first part of the ELD standards, as you can see on this slide, is titled Interacting in Meaningful Ways. And you'll notice these 3 bubbles. Each one of these bubbles contains a small cluster of standards, of ELD standards. And if you look and read the title in each of the bubbles, you'll take note that those clusters of ELD standards are designed to do what that bubble indicates. So that first purple bubble, those cluster of standards are designed for us to be able to design opportunities for students to collaborate with each other using text to develop their listening and speaking skills. Very deliberate, no guessing. Those cluster of standards are designed for us to provide opportunities for kids to collaborate with each other, with us, using text, grade level text, for the purpose of developing their listening and speaking skills. Moving on, the productive cluster of standards, again, will provide opportunities for students to engage with each other, right? Because the whole goal here is to interact in meaningful ways. That's the whole goal for part 1. So using their speaking and writing skills. So those productive standards are going to give me some insight as to how to develop lessons and deliver lessons so that students are developing their speaking and writing skills by producing language, both speaking and in writing. And the next bubble is interpretive. So this is the receptive skills, right? What is it that I need to do via the standards in the interpretive mode so that I'm providing the appropriate scaffolds so that students' reading and listening skills are being developed. So what kinds of visuals am I using so kids can understand what I'm talking about or reading, right? So again, very deliberate in the organization. So all of the standards in part 1, organized by these 3 distinct clusters, are designed to develop listening, speaking, reading, and writing skills. And the color coding helps facilitate how we navigate through the document to be able to identify part 1 standards, right? How to interact in meaningful ways. So if I'm developing reading and listening skills, I'm not doing that by myself, right? It's Lupa and I interacting with each other in a meaningful way, maybe co-reading a piece of text using some visuals. Maybe I'm reading and she's listening, and then she's responding and I'm responding. So again, it could look in many different ways, but the standards are going to guide how I'm specifically and intentionally creating lessons to address the development of these very important skills. So in a nutshell, that's part 1. Now let's focus our attention to part 2. Like part 1, part 2 has its own cluster of standards, each one focusing on very specific content. In this case, overall, the purpose of the part 2 ELD standards are to provide opportunities for students to learn how the English language works. So let's think about that for a little bit. How the English language works. I'm an English learner. My parents immigrated from Mexico. They don't speak English. My siblings and I learned English in school. And I recall paying really close attention to what people would say, teachers would say, and then followed by what they would do. And then the same with my peers, right? So teacher would say something, teacher would do something, I would watch for what they were doing, and then I would watch the kids. And then I would do what the kids would do. More often than not, that's what all of our students do, those that are just beginning to learn English, right? So we're learning how the English language works using our senses at the very beginning. So think about that, right? So the whole focus of part 2 is to peel back that curtain and show kids, right, how the English language works. Sometimes we're going to use strategies that require primary language. Wait a minute, ELD, English only? Yes, absolutely. Their practice and application is English only. When kids need to understand the what and the how, primary language plays a role. So we explain what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, and you're going to practice it in English. Okay, so I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit, but I'm gonna want to front that information because it's important for us not only to provide students opportunities to practice using the English language, we want them to understand how the English language is organized and why, and what elements of the English language when connected make meaning so that they're able to understand it and then use it, right? The more we understand how English works, the more we're going to be able to apply it. So these clusters of standards in the part 2 are all designed to give us insight as to how to design and deliver lessons to help students understand how the English language works. And I want you to notice that this requires us using text, grade level text, so that we can point to a resource, a word, a phrase, sentence, paragraph, and help students make connections with what is written, what it means, and how it relates to different elements of that text. We're going to be calling out elements of the English language that makes text cohesive. How does this word relate to this description at the bottom of the paragraph? Or connecting and condensing ideas, or expanding and enriching ideas. So again, we're taking elements of the English language, what we used to do, right? But we're actually connecting it to meaning. Whereas before, it was mostly about identifying parts of speech, where now it's identifying how certain phrases, which contain parts of speech, help us make meaning of the overall message in the sentence or paragraph. So it really is more about making meaning than it is about learning what these words are. And then down at the bottom, part 3, using foundational literacy skills. These are not a separate set of standards, rather these are the common core foundational literacy skills for K-5. So why do they live here? Why are they called out as ELD standards? Because for some English learners with limited literacy in their primary language and limited literacy in English, the foundational literacy skills play a critical role, particularly for English learners whose language is very similar to English. Let's focus on our Spanish speakers, since that is the majority of English learners in the state of California. So the alphabet in Spanish is very similar, extremely similar to the alphabet in English. Words, cognates, lots of them, right? Sounds, very similar. There's just a few distinctions in between, particularly the vowels in English. So using the foundational literacy skills in English and making connections to the primary language whenever possible, whenever we're able to, is going to help build those foundational literacy skills in English. Again, going back to primary language being instrumental in helping develop that second language. So the role of the foundational literacy skills, part 3 of the ELD standards, again, are your common core foundational literacy skills. Our approach for English learners is to use them as it relates to their primary language, making connections, right, whenever possible and appropriate. It's not always going to be the case, considering that there are multiple languages and not all of them mirror the English language, but some do. And when they do, we want to be able to maximize and tap into that language resource that students already have. Okay, so that was part 1, part 2, and part 3. Now I want to call your attention to some of the other graphics in this visual. First, let's focus on that arrow in between part 1 and part 2. I want you to take note that it's pointing in both directions, because that's an indication that the part 1 and part 2 ELD standards are designed to be used together. In other words, please don't approach the ELD standards through the lens of, we're going to only work with part 1 first, and once the students have mastered the part 1 standards, we're going to move into part 2. Just like we can't teach language in a vacuum, we can't use the standards that way. Because if you're having kids interact in meaningful ways to develop listening, speaking, reading, and writing skills, in order for it to be a meaningful way, they need to understand the meaning, right? They need to understand how the English language is working to build meaning. In other words, we talk about how English works. This is the what, this is what's happening, so that kids can engage and practice using what they learned. So part 2 is the what about English. Part 1 is the how they implement and apply it, and through that process, develop and acquire it. So part 2, how English works. Part 2, what English is about. Part 1, how I engage in using that newfound language. Now let me take your direction to the bottom of the screen with the 3 proficiency levels: emerging, expanding, and bridging. We went from 5 to 3. There really is no research to support that 3 is better than 4, rather, other than, for the most part, if you've been in education for a while, when we would group our students, we would end up grouping them into 3 groups, right, rather than the 5 levels. So that was taken, believe it or not, true story, that was taken into consideration when determining that 3 levels would be more appropriate, based on practice, current practices. So we have the emerging, expanding, and bridging level. However, what's important here are those arrows before and throughout and after. Those arrows are an indication that although we've identified 3 distinct levels, students are able to show growth within those levels. So they really are kind of a more assets-based approach to identifying proficiency levels that were in the past. Where in the past, those 5 levels, you lived in that level and there was very little discussion about or acknowledgement of students progressing within any given level, even though progress was being made. So here we're taking note that at the emerging level, there will be different levels within that one level based on the student's linguistic ability. Let me take your memory back to the slide with the language acquisition phases, and where I talked about how at any given phase, students will present a more advanced proficiency in perhaps a listening skill, but lag a little bit in their writing skill. And so that's why we want to capture, that's what we are trying to capture with these arrows, that although students may fall in these given levels, it's important for us to take note that that one level doesn't capture all of their abilities depending on which particular skill we're focusing on. So I'm going to go to the bridging level. So a little while ago, I mentioned that I am an English learner. I continue to be an English learner. And a good example that I can give you is as I enter this work, when I came to this grant work, there was a whole new world of terminology that I needed to learn, right? Sped lingo, right? And so as an English learner, I needed to build some context around these new words and what they mean, right? How the language works, how English works. Because I'm proficient in English, I was able to draw on my already proficient linguistic skills in English, and it was relatively easier for me to understand and learn this new language, if you will, or terms, if you will. So I'm going to go back even further. When I was in elementary school, right, my linguistic abilities, my reading and writing and listening and speaking abilities were very different in English than they were when I got to high school and I needed to write more complex pieces and read more dense text, or college, right? So because I am an English learner, once I mastered the English language, just learning the new nuances of English, depending on the context, whether it was, higher education or this new work, my ability to be able to learn more words and apply them in my work was easier, but not until I became proficient in English, right? So again, it's really important to call out and to understand that how critical it is for our English learners to master the English language so that they can continue to expand on their knowledge base. So the same way that you and I would, whether you're an English learner or not. So again, so important for us to be able to understand how to use these resources. And I feel that by understanding how they're organized, it's a better understanding of how to better utilize them. Okay, I'm going to pause to see if there are any questions here or in the chat regarding the structure and the organization of the ELD standards. And just an FYI, you can click on the graphic and or the ELD standards image to access either or both of these resources. Okay. So if it's new knowledge, it may feel like a lot, but once you get in there and you start becoming familiar with what is in this document, the ELD standards, I think you'll be able to make connections with some of the practices that you probably are already implementing, and now it's a matter of just being more intentional, right? Okay. So it's important for us, again, to recognize that without these resources, we're not meeting the mark, right? We're not addressing the specific needs that the kiddos need. And as we have ELD standards for all of our English learners, we have the ELD connectors for our English learners with more intensive needs. And if you're familiar, the more familiar we are with the first document, the connectors are going to make more sense because, again, they are further scaffolded to address the unique needs of intensive learners. So again, please take some time to work with a colleague and dig into these resources and start implementing them slowly but surely into your work, whether you're a general education teacher, working with a SPED teacher, co-teaching, or writing your IEPs. It's absolutely critical that we use them so that we're able to provide the appropriate supports our English learners with disabilities need. Because again, all English learners, including English learners with disabilities, must receive comprehensive ELD, and like Vanessa reminded us, comprehensive ELD is part of Tier 1 core instruction. It is not an intervention, right? Because again, being an English learner is not a qualifying category. It is a federal entitlement of all English learners to receive EL services. In California, it's through comprehensive ELD. So let's talk a little bit about some tools that can be found in the California Practitioner's Guide to help us be more intentional in providing these types of supports and services. Figure 7.1 is a list of framing questions that are, and I've taken the liberty to underline, to highlight some of the key things that we want to remember as we're thinking about how to design and deliver ELD instruction for our students with disabilities. So it's important for us to understand the students' language proficiency level so that we're able to use the standards that are designed for that given proficiency level because they are organized by proficiency level. Therefore, it's important that we know how to use the ELD standards, right? So what is the student's proficiency level? Where can I find the standards by proficiency level in this resource? I also want to take into consideration not only the student's language proficiency level, but what are some of the challenges that may be identified in the IEP that directly relate to language, and what are some of the supports that I need to start thinking about the supports that I need to connect to those challenges. And in order for students to be able to learn and acquire the English and meet their respective IEP goals, how am I going to provide opportunities for students to interact with each other, with me, and with the text so that they're internalizing, practicing, and developing their language skills, and in the process, meeting their goals? Also, what types of scaffolding, accommodations, and modifications are necessary, right? So all of that information can be found in their IEP and also the ELD standards when we're making those connections, right? Their proficiency level and their challenges. So this resource is, again, it's a good resource to have handy when you are rethinking how to design and deliver your ELD lessons. And then also let's take into consideration what their specific needs are based on their IEP. Are we taking into consideration the need of assistive technology? Is that something that we also want to embed? And what role does that play in language production and or their receptive understanding of language? We want to take into consideration what specific equipment might be necessary in a low incidence disability if the student is needing some very specific equipment. Again, in order for kids to be able to engage and interact with each other, we have to be able to afford them the tools that they absolutely need. I know we have experts here in the area of visually impaired and deaf of hard of hearing, and and if you know somebody in your site, in your district, that has that expertise, reaching out to them and then talking about what would this look like in a comprehensive ELD scenario, in designated ELD, and integrated ELD. How might we best incorporate these necessary tools so that students are able to engage? Another resource that I want to share with you is Figure 7.10. Again, this is just one element. I think there's 9 different components. This one only focuses on the role of background knowledge, right? So in this case, we're taking into consideration leveraging background knowledge and how critical it is for us to be able to tap into students' understanding and knowledge of language, of the content. Again, being an English learner is not a deficit. The video reminded us that, kids are not broken. We just need to be able to connect with them and provide the appropriate supports and develop an environment that is conducive to learning so that they're able to thrive and that they feel welcome and safe. So in this case, we're focusing on leveraging background knowledge. And I took the liberty of kind of highlighting the role that you see here of primary language. So using primary language as a scaffold or as a strategy does not necessarily mean to translate everything. It means to take notice of what the student is able to do in English and where we might need to step in providing primary language support. If you are not able to use primary language support because you're not a speaker of the student's native language, perhaps another child might be a good scaffold. I am a firm believer that students are each other's best scaffold when we set up opportunities that are very strategic and intentional for them to collaborate and work together. So the role of primary language plays a critical role in learning and in engaging. And so what are some of the resources that we can use to help support that? When I taught in Calexico for a few years before I started my career at the county office. And I loved providing kids an opportunity to work together because I felt that they did a better job at enhancing and pushing each other than I did trying to, navigate 30 plus kids throughout the day. So I broke up my day, giving kids an opportunity to work together. I even set them up into pods. And many times, when they were processing information together, it was in their primary language. And I never felt, seriously folks, I never felt that that was a hindrance to their learning. As a matter of fact, research will indicate that that is going to support and enhance and deepen learning because they're able to flesh things out and use and manipulate language in different ways, so that then my job is to provide the appropriate tools and labels in English for them to take that knowledge that they learned and built together and apply it with these new language skills in English. So rather than trying to force fit information that would, be difficult for them to process in the language that they were learning, would let them engage and flesh out their ideas, jot down whatever they needed to jot down in their primary language, talk about it in their primary language, and then provide tools in English for them to transfer it. The knowledge was there, right? And it wasn't a struggle to get that information out when the role of their primary language was something that they could use, that linguistic tool that they had, they could use it. Now it's just a matter of me providing that very explicit support in English. So again, the role of primary language is important, and it's an asset, and it's not a hindrance to English language development. However, when we create a crutch by translating everything, then students are going to shut off and wait for the translation, if you will. So again, we need to really understand how to use primary language as a support, when to use it, and how to really send that message that it plays a role in learning. Oh, I said all of that already, right? So again, the role of primary language. So here are just some examples of what that could look like. So providing some explanations in some instructions, not a word-by-word translation, but just, maybe checking in and just pointing out certain things in the primary language whenever necessary and whenever available. Some degree of written translation, right? Attention to cognates. There's several cognates, particularly between English and Spanish. And then, I guess, again, inviting students to speak and write in their primary language. I gave you an example of that when I was a 4th grade teacher back in the day. And finally, the idea of accommodations and modifications, right? So if we want to be able to provide access and quality curricula for our English learners, these are some 4 things to consider, right? This is how we do it. This is how we do it. We have to incorporate the principles of universal design for learning to provide access for all of our learners, particularly our English learners with disabilities. We absolutely must use evidence-based instructional strategies. I'm a fan of Pinterest, but not everything on there is research-based. And so if we want to get more bang for our buck, we want to make sure that the strategies and tools that we're using are evidence-based, and there's tons of them, folks. We also want to make sure that the materials and the curricula and the environment are culturally and linguistically based, right? We want to take note of who is in our room and address their what they value, their needs, and navigate through that in a respectful and inclusive manner. And then again, being culturally and linguistically responsive is critical. So, talked a whole lot. One final resource regarding accommodations. Here are some examples, right, of what the accommodations may look like in a classroom setting. And again, a reminder that accommodations do not reduce the learning performance or expectations any more than me putting on my glasses do to enhance what I'm seeing. Without my glasses, I can't see it and I can't read the text as well as I can with them. So I need that accommodation to be able to engage. It doesn't make what I look at any better or any clearer than it does for somebody who doesn't need the same tool. So again, just a reminder that accommodations are necessary and appropriate. And we have one final resource that we want to share with you, but I do want Vanessa to walk us through it because she actually created this resource. And because of that, she will be able to more eloquently explain how it's designed and recommendations for how to use it. We've shared a lot with you. And so this student scenario, the Mateo student scenario, it really captures all of the ideas and resources that we've shared with you today in a student scenario format. And Vanessa created this companion to that student scenario, and I'm going to hand it over to her so she can walk you through what that looks like in practice.
All right, guys. So it's been a lot of information. So we always like to provide you with a resource that's going to help you tie it together and take it back to your sites to support your individual needs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this resource so that you can see what it looks like. Number one, you have the student scenario. And the student scenario, again, allows us to meet Mateo, who's an 8th grader at Dolores Huerta Middle School. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to match resources to identify and support individual student needs. So by clicking on this document, it's going to pop open the activity. You'll have the student scenario. You'll meet Mateo. Get some basic demographic and background information on Mateo. Learn about his comprehensive ELD program. Focus in on the IEP meeting in middle school. We're going to review those goals and objectives. Focus in on developing family and school relationships. And take a look at the thinking, at the process through which the team is going to support Mateo's needs. The teachers are working on, they have a professional learning group that is focusing in on structuring opportunities for students to engage in meaningful academic discussion, supporting students' academic vocabulary development, etc. You can read it here. What does this have to do with Mateo? Well, that PD is going to impact his access to integrated and designated ELD. We know that on top of comprehensive ELD, Mateo receives support and services from the special education specialist using a co-teaching model. So again, what the student scenario does is it provides us with a series of examples of how it is that we tie it all together. What might comprehensive ELD look like? What does special education services look like for Mateo? When we review and set new IEP goals, what are we discussing? Here we have an interaction between Ms. Pan and Mr. Jackson, the ELD teacher, and the actual case manager. In reviewing the IEP goals, they are tracking progress. They are looking at specific refinements that teachers have made to their practice over the past couple of years to support Mateo. Mateo is also actively engaged in this conversation during the IEP meeting, where he's sharing that he feels that he's making progress. The team creates an IEP goal for Mateo that focuses on improving disciplinary writing and social studies through more intensive integrated ELD. They looked at the LPAC results. Mateo is at the expanding level. Therefore, the team sets an IEP goal that is linguistically appropriate by focusing in on Common Core standards for ELA literacy and also California ELD standards at the bridging level. So again, the student scenario really helps you tie it together, looking at the academic requirements, the linguistic supports, how the team interacts and collaborates in developing some of the resources. Also, you're able to see how Mr. Pan and Mr. Jackson scaffold student writing by providing some supports. Again, if you're like me and you learn by following examples, the student scenario can help you do just that. We're not saying that this is an all-encompassing, the panacea of all supports to be provided. However, it's a great starting point in reflecting and selecting what it is that we might do for our students with unique needs. Miss Pan, and Mr. Jackson said that sentence starters might be useful language supports. Academic vocabulary will, remember, primary real estate in our classrooms. How are we using the environment to support our students? Graphic organizers, charts, reflection guides, protocols for peer feedback. Again, all of these ideas are presented here, and these weren't developed by just one person. It was in collaboration. That meshing of superpowers, those silos, those connected silos of expertise. And then they go on to describe designated ELD. Again, if you're looking for a more concrete example of what it might look like, here it is. Here's an example for you. The student scenario then continues. And what we've done is we want to help you connect the dots. So we developed this resource that allows you to participate in a close activity, a resource close activity of sorts. So to further support your MDT teams in the IEP development for dually identified students, we took chapters 5, 6, and 7 and put all of the resources that might be supportive in engaging you in linguistically appropriate goals and objectives, developing an IEP that meets the needs of all English learners, educational programming with a focus on access and equity, as well as Chapter 7, Teaching and Learning to Meet Student Needs. So every single one of the resources that we shared with you have been included here. It is a hyperdoc that has access to every single document that was selected. One of the ways that this activity can be used is with your team. Take a look at the student scenario, read it, and start really engaging in a reflective conversation as to, you know what, this is missing in our process. You know what, this is a great tool to support us in engaging in this process. Again, a lot of this is reflective, But let's not stop at reflection. Let's start attaching actionable steps. And one of the ways that we can engage in actionable next steps is by identifying a single resource, just one, and making it work for you and your students. So again, all of these resources are listed there for you to access as you are looking at identifying and supporting individualized student needs. Student needs who are really inclusive of all areas: language disability, language acquisition. I'm going to hand it back to Lupita.
Stay up here with me, Vanessa. We're closing shop, folks. We often like to close our presentations with this quote that comes directly from chapter 7. And I invite you to read it to yourself. But we've highlighted some key features in this quote as a reminder that this work is challenging work. Therefore, it being a shared responsibility, not only because it is what we signed up to do, what I often like to say, we signed up to do this, because it's going to enable us to work smarter and provide the very best support for our English learners and English learners with disabilities. Taking into consideration the role of the parents and inviting them and providing opportunities for them to engage with us that is cultural and linguistically appropriate, right? Making sure that we're clear about the processes, that they feel welcome, and that they have a critical role to play in the progress of their student, and that we are on the same page. We are rooting for the same team. So all of those things are also will have a positive impact, not only on our systems, but as the student progresses through their educational career. Ensuring that we are getting the appropriate training, using the appropriate resources, and that we're providing support if we are in that position, and are receiving the support, because we need to advocate for ourselves too. If we know that we need to better understand the ELD standards, then reach out to your coaches, to your administrators, and request that support and training. Quality teaching and learning is a responsibility of all of us, regardless of your scope of work, regardless of your responsibility or your title. And that's why it is a shared responsibility. It is a collective commitment. And so with that, I want to invite our team, Vanessa and our Senior Director, Christina, to the front as we close shop together. I forgot my clicker. Do you have it? Can you bring it with you? Click to the next slide for us, please. Thank you. So with that, we want to hang back and allow you some time to either unmute, we'll go back to the chat box, or if you're here in person with us, to ask questions of us, to ask questions of some of the resources that we've shared with you today. Do one more click for me. Thank you. And we want to invite you to visit our website, drop us a shout out on Twitter. Let us know what worked for you. Let us know what resources you appreciate on our website. If you haven't visited our website, please take a look, see what's there. Let us know what you like. And if you have any other questions that may come after the fact, feel free to email us. We all use that email, and we all receive that email. And so we will do our very best to connect you to the resources that you're looking for, and to address your questions. One more click. With that, we want to say thank you. On behalf of Imperial County SELPA, Imperial County Office of Education, and this work, Improving Outcomes for English Learners with Disabilities, we thank you for your time. We thank you for your support, for your interaction, and most importantly, we thank you for your willingness to dare make an impact, a change in our current practices. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Christina to close us out.
Thank you, Lupita. I appreciate everyone that was here today, both in person and via Zoom. Please continue to visit our website, look at past modules, the past trainings that we've had on the previous sections, and we look forward to our next session in March. And we'll send that flyer out again. So thank you, everyone. Wishing you a wonderful afternoon. Take care.
Want to
Bye-bye.
give one final shout out
Oh.
to our tech friends over here who've been helping us.
Yay!
Aaron and
Yes.
JC, thank you so much. They're behind the scenes, but they make it all
They're
happen.
amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.